Margaret Doyle was on her knees in the mud when the lightning split the sky over Stone Creek Ranch, one hand pressed to a split lip, the other clawing at the bottom rail of the gate. And she did not know if she had the strength left to knock. Behind her, 3 miles back down the road, the men of Miller's Creek had thrown stones at her cart and called her a thief for asking the mercantile owner if she could sweep his floor for a heel of bread. One stone had caught her above the eye. She had not stopped walking since. She reached up, knuckles bloodied, and struck the door 3 times. "Please," she whispered when it opened. "I don't need much. Just whatever you were going to throw away would be enough." If you're watching this from a small town of your own, one where people decided who you were before they ever learned your name, type your city in the comments below, so I know how far this story has traveled tonight. And if stories like Margaret's mean something to you, hit that subscribe button and stay with me all the way to the end, because what happens next changes everything. The door swung inward on a groan of old hinges, and lamplight spilled out across Margaret's ruined dress before she could raise her head to see who stood there. "Lord above," a man's voice said, low and rough with sleep he hadn't gotten yet. "Ma'am, you're bleeding." Margaret flinched back from the light instinctively, the way she had learned to flinch from doorways in a dozen towns before this one. She kept her eyes on the mud between her knees. "I ain't looking for trouble, mister," she said. "I'm looking for scraps. Anything left in the pot. I'll be gone by morning, I swear it." "You'll be gone by morning over my dead body with a cut like that, going untended." The man crouched down in front of her, and even through the rain and the dark, Margaret could make out the shape of him, broad through the shoulders, a jaw set hard with worry rather than anger. Hands that reached toward her slow and careful, like she was a spooked horse he didn't want to startle. "Name's Thomas Bridger. This is my land you're kneeling on. Can you stand?" "I can stand." She couldn't not yet, not with her knees shaking the way they were, but pride made her try anyway, and she got halfway up before her legs betrayed her. Thomas caught her before she hit the ground again. He didn't hesitate, didn't recoil at the weight of her the way men usually did when they found out a woman her size needed catching. He simply braced his boots wider and held her steady until she found her footing. The way a rancher braces against a heifer that's lost its balance in the chute. No drama in it, no judgment, just plain work. "I've got you," he said. "Come on inside now, out of this rain. Mr. Bridger, I mean it. I only came for... I heard what you came for." He kept one hand under her elbow as he guided her over the threshold. "And I'm telling you, it ain't scraps you're getting tonight." The kitchen was warm, in a way Margaret hadn't felt in longer than she wanted to admit. The banked coals in the stove still throwing off heat. A coffee pot sitting cold on the back burner. Thomas sat her down hard in a chair at the table. A real table with a real cloth on it. Faded but clean, and turned without another word to the stove, working the damper, feeding and kindling with the quick practiced hands of a man who'd built 1,000 fires in his life. "You don't need to trouble yourself," Margaret said. "I only need a crust. Please, I don't want to be any bother to you." "Ma'am." Thomas didn't turn around. "You've been a bother to nobody. Somebody's been a bother to you. There's a difference, and I intend to feed you regardless of which one of us you think I am." She didn't have an answer for that. Nobody had ever put it to her quite that way before, that the trouble wasn't hers to apologize for, that maybe the fault lay somewhere else entirely. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, dripping onto the floorboards, and watched a stranger build up a fire for her, like she was worth the wood. Within 20 minutes, he had eggs cracking in a skillet, a heel of yesterday's bread warming in the oven, coffee grounds going into the pot. He set a plate down in front of her that was not scraps by any measure. 3 eggs thick cut. Bacon bread with butter melting soft into it. A wedge of dried apple pie he must have been saving for his own breakfast. Margaret stared at it like she didn't trust her eyes. "This is too much," she said. "I only asked for..." "Ma'am, with respect, I didn't ask what you thought was fair. I asked what a person needs, and then I made it." Thomas pulled out the chair across from her and sat, the wood creaking under him. "Food belongs on a table, not thrown to the dogs, not left to rot on a step because a body's too proud or too scared to walk through a door. You're at my table now, Eat. She ate. She tried to eat. Slowly, tried to remember whatever manners her mother had once taught her about not looking desperate in front of decent company, but 3 days without a full meal made a liar out of good intentions. And by the third bite, her hands were shaking too hard to hide it. Thomas watched her without a word of judgment on his face. Only something quieter. Something that looked almost like anger. Not at her, she realized slowly, but at whoever had let a woman get this hungry in the first place. "Miller's Creek do this to you?" he asked finally. Margaret's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. "You don't want to know what Miller's Creek did to me, Mr. Bridger?" I asked. She set the fork down. Some instinct told her this man wasn't asking to make conversation, wasn't asking to be polite. He was asking because he intended to do something with the answer, and that frightened her almost as much as the men who'd thrown the stone. "I went into the mercantile," she said slowly, "and asked if I could sweep the floors for bread." The owner laughed, said a woman my size ought to be doing the eating, not the sweeping, and that if he wanted his floors swept, he'd hire someone who could bend down far enough to reach them. Her jaw tightened. His customers laughed along with him. When I left, some of the younger men followed me out to my cart, threw stones, called me things I won't repeat at a decent man's table. "Say them anyway." "Mr. Bridger, say them." His voice hadn't risen, but something in it had gone flat and hard, like a blade laid down on a table. "I need to know exactly what kind of men I'm dealing with come morning." Margaret's throat tightened. She hadn't expected anyone to want the truth of it, let alone a stranger who'd fed her before he'd even learned her name. "They called me a fat beggar woman. Said no decent man would ever want a wife who ate as much as 3, and that I ought to be grateful for whatever scraps I could get, because scraps were all a woman like me was fit for." The silence that followed was long enough that Margaret began to regret every word of it, certain she'd see the same disgust in his face that she'd seen in every face for years. Instead, Thomas Bridger set his jaw, looked her dead in the eye, and said the words that would follow her for the rest of her life. "Then Miller's Creek is full of fools, and you've had the great misfortune of meeting every one of them before you met a single decent soul. That ends tonight. In this house, you eat what's on the table same as anyone else who sits at it. You hear me?" Margaret's eyes burned, and she looked down fast, blinking hard, because it had been so long since a man's voice had defended her instead of dismissing her that she didn't quite know what to do with the feeling rising in her chest. "I hear you," she said when she trusted her voice again. "Good. Now eat that pie before it gets cold, because I made it myself and I'm prouder of it than I ought to admit." A laugh startled its way out of her, small and rusty, like a door that hadn't opened in years. Thomas Bridger's mouth twitched at the corner, not quite a smile, but close enough kin to one that Margaret found herself studying his face in the lamplight. He was younger than she'd first guessed, maybe 38, with a scar through one eyebrow and hands scarred rougher still, a man who'd clearly done every hard thing this land could ask of him and asked for nothing in return. She finished the pie. She finished all of it down to the crumbs, and when Thomas rose to pour her a second cup of coffee, she found herself asking the question she hadn't dared ask anyone in 3 weeks of wandering. "Mr. Bridger, do you have work? Any work at all? I can cook. I mean, truly cook, not just eggs. I can mend, keep accounts, manage a pantry so nothing spoils and nothing goes missing. I worked in my father's store for 11 years before—" She stopped herself. Before what? Before it doesn't matter anymore. She looked down at her hands. "I know how it looks. A woman my size showing up out of a storm asking for work. You don't owe me anything more than what you've already given me tonight, and I'm grateful for that alone. I only thought I'd ask." Thomas set the coffee pot down slow and deliberate, the way a man sets down a tool he's decided to pick back up later, and looked at her for a long moment. "I run 4,000 head of cattle on 11,000 acres with 6 hands and no wife," he said. "My housekeeper of 9 years passed this spring. God rest her, and since then this house has been eating burnt beans and wearing torn shirts because I can rope a steer in the dark, but I cannot for the life of me keep a stitch straight or a ledger balanced." He crossed his arms. "You're telling me you can cook, mend, and keep accounts?" "Yes, sir." "Then as far as I'm concerned, you walked up to my gate tonight asking for scraps, and instead, You're about to save this ranch a world of trouble. Room and board, fair wages starting tomorrow if you're willing. I'll not have you sleeping under a wagon one more night while there's a decent bed going empty in this house." Margaret's hands came up over her mouth before she could stop them. She had spent 3 years being told in 100 different ways that she was a burden the world could barely tolerate, and now a stranger with kind eyes and a scarred eyebrow was offering her a bed, a wage, and a place at his table, all inside the same hour he'd met her. "Why?" she asked when she could speak again. "Why would you do this for a woman you don't even know?" Thomas considered the question with the same seriousness he seemed to give everything. "Because my mother used to say the Lord doesn't send strangers to your door by accident," he said. "And because I've buried enough good people on this land to know that kindness costs a man nothing but his pride, and pride's never fed a soul or fixed a fence." He picked the coffee pot back up. "Besides, any woman who can keep a ledger balanced is worth 10 men who can only sit a horse. This ranch needs saving, Miss Doyle, whether you knew it walking up that road or not." She didn't understand yet how true those words would turn out to be. She only knew, sitting in the warm kitchen, with a full stomach for the first time in weeks, that something in her chest had cracked open, not from the hunger and not from the cold, but from the astonishing, unfamiliar weight of being wanted. Morning came hard and gray, the storm blown out overnight into a fine drizzle that clung to the yard like a held breath. Margaret woke in a real bed under a real quilt and lay still for a long moment, simply listening to the sounds of a working ranch coming to life outside her window. Men's voices, the clatter of a bucket, a rooster 3 days late to his own alarm. She dressed quickly in the same worn dress, the only one she owned, that wasn't in her cloth bag torn beyond mending, and made her way down to the kitchen, determined to prove, before the sun was fully up, that Thomas Bridger had not made a mistake in taking her in. She was elbow-deep in flour biscuits already rising in the oven, bacon crackling in the skillet, when the back door banged open and a wiry man with tobacco-stained teeth and suspicious eyes stopped dead in the doorway. "Who in the blazes are you?" Margaret straightened, wiping her hands on her apron. "Margaret Doyle. I'm the new housekeeper. And you are?" "Otis Reyes. Foreman of this outfit for 6 years, and nobody told me Bridger hired a housekeeper, let alone one who—" He stopped himself, but not soon enough. His eyes flicking down her frame and back up with the same look she'd learned to dread from a dozen men in a dozen towns. "Let alone one who's built the way I'm built." Margaret finished for him, calm as still water, though her hands had gone tight at her sides beneath the apron. "You can say it, Mr. Reyes. I've heard it before." Otis had the decency to flush. "Wasn't going to say nothing of the sort, ma'am." "You were about to. It's all right. I'd rather a man be plain about it than smile at my face and whisper behind my back." She turned the bacon with more force than strictly necessary. "I cook, I clean, I mend, and I keep books better than most men who've been trained to it. Mr. Bridger hired me last night, and I intend to earn every penny of those wages starting with this breakfast. If you've got a problem with that, you can take it up with him." The kitchen went quiet, except for the pop and hiss of the skillet. Otis studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his suspicious eyes, not quite respect yet, but the first crack in the wall of it. "Never said I had a problem, ma'am," he muttered, finally reaching for the coffee pot. "Just wasn't expecting company at the stove is all." "Well, you've got it now. Sit yourself down, Mr. Reyes. Breakfast is nearly ready, and I don't serve it cold to a man who's been up working since before dawn." By the time Thomas came down 20 minutes later, 5 ranch hands were seated around the table. Otis, a young hand named Ezra, who couldn't have been past 19, 2 brothers named Dutch and Carl Hollis, who eyed Margaret with open skepticism, and an older man called Silver Jack, who said nothing at all, but watched everything. The table was laid with more food than any of them had seen in months. Biscuits split and buttered bacon crisp at the edges, eggs done exactly as each man liked them, because Margaret had asked, and gravy thick enough to stand a spoon in. Thomas stopped in the doorway and simply looked at it for a moment, the way a man looks at rain after a long drought. "Well," he said, "I see introductions have been made." "This is Margaret Doyle," Otis said, and there was something almost defensive in the way he said it now, like a man staking a claim on a discovery he intended to protect. "New housekeeper. Cooks like this every morning, boss. I'll dig her a grave myself when the day comes, and gladly. Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks, unused to praise landing so plainly, but she covered it by setting the last plate down and taking her seat at the foot of the table, the way she assumed a housekeeper ought to. "Not at the foot," Thomas said. "Not in this house. Sit up here, Miss Doyle, where the rest of us can hear you when you tell us we're eating too fast." Dutch Hollis snorted into his coffee. "Since when's the housekeeper eat with the family boss?" "Since I decided it," Thomas said without heat, but with a finality that closed the subject entirely. "Any man at this table who's got a problem with where Miss Doyle sits is welcome to eat his breakfast standing up in the yard. The rest of you pass the biscuits." Nobody moved to stand in the yard. Dutch's ears went red, but he passed the biscuits, and Margaret understood in that quiet exchange something important about the man who'd taken her in, that his kindness came with a spine of iron underneath it, and that he did not offer protection halfway. The days that followed fell into a rhythm Margaret hadn't known in years. She woke before the sun had the stove going, and coffee brewing before the first hand stumbled out to the barn, cooked 3 meals that grew more elaborate as she found her feet in the pantry, mended shirts and trousers worn thin from years of hard riding, scrubbed floors that hadn't seen a proper cleaning since the old housekeeper's illness had taken her strength months before her life. She learned the men's names, their habits, their small kindnesses hidden under rough exteriors. Ezra, the youngest, missed his mother something fierce and lit up like a lantern whenever Margaret made the cornbread the way his mother used to. Silver Jack, silent as stone, had lost 2 fingers to a rope years back and struggled with buttons. Margaret began sewing wider buttonholes into his shirts without a word said between them, and found a jar of wildflowers on the kitchen sill the next morning that she was fairly certain hadn't grown there on its own. Even Dutch and Carl thawed slowly the way ice thaws on a pond. Nobody's watching first, accepting second helpings without complaint, then thanking her for them. Then one evening confessing over dish scraping that their own mother back in Missouri made a chicken and dumplings not half so good as Margaret's. A confession Dutch clearly regretted the moment it left his mouth, but Margaret treasured all the same. Only Otis remained watchful in a different way than the others. Not suspicious of her competence anymore, she realized, but worried about something else entirely. Something he wouldn't name even when she asked him plainly one evening while they closed up the henhouse together. "Something's troubling you, Mr. Reyes," she said. "You've had that look on your face for 3 days now." Otis latched the henhouse door and didn't look at her right away. "It ain't my place to say, ma'am. You've clearly decided otherwise, or you wouldn't have that look." He sighed long and heavy, a man carrying weight he'd carried alone too long. "This ranch is in trouble, Miss Doyle. Has been for near 2 years now. Bridger works himself half to death every season cattle sell fair, and still the money don't stretch the way it ought. I've seen the ledgers when he lets me numbers don't add up right, and I ain't got the schooling to say why. He thinks it's bad luck. Bad weather, bad markets. I ain't so sure." Margaret went very still. "What do you think it is?" "I think somebody in this territory's got their thumb on the scale," Otis said quietly. "And I think that somebody's got a reason not to want Thomas Bridger looking too close at his own books." That night, Margaret lay awake long after the house had gone quiet, staring up at a ceiling she was only beginning to think of as her own, turning Otis's words over and over. She had spent 11 years in her father's store, learning to read numbers the way other people read faces, learning what a column of figures could confess if a person only knew how to ask the right questions of it. Something in her, some old instinct sharpened by years of counting other men's coin, told her that Otis Reyes was not a foolish man and that his worry was not idle. She did not yet know the name Silas Crane. She did not yet know that in 3 days' time a black buggy with silver fittings would come up the Stone Creek Road and change everything. But lying there in the dark, listening to the rain start up soft against the window, Margaret Doyle made a quiet decision that would put her on a collision course with the most dangerous man in the territory. She decided she would find a way to see those ledgers for herself. The chance came sooner than she expected. 3 mornings later, Thomas came in from the barn, with his face carved from granite, a stack of papers clutched in one fist like they'd personally wronged him. "Everything all right?" Margaret asked, setting down the coffee pot. Bank sent a man out with papers. Thomas dropped into his chair heavier than usual. Says my loan comes due in 6 weeks. Full amount. Says if I can't pay it, the bank takes the north pasture as collateral, the good grazing land, the water rights, all of it. Margaret's hands stilled on the pot. 6 weeks. That's sudden, isn't it? Loans don't usually call due without warning. That's what I said. Thomas rubbed a hand over his face, and for the first time since she'd met him, Margaret saw exhaustion in him that ran bone deep, the kind that came not from hard work, but from fighting something he couldn't see clearly enough to hit. Man said it's all there in the original terms. I don't rightly remember signing anything about 6 weeks' notice, but it's been 4 years, and I never was one for reading fine print when I trusted the fella handing me the pen. Who was the fella handing you the pen? Thomas looked up at her, something in her tone catching his attention. Silas Crane. Owns the bank in town, half the cattle contracts in the territory besides. Everybody does business with Crane sooner or later. Man's got more money than the governor, and twice the manners when it suits him. Margaret set the coffee pot down very carefully because her hands had begun to tremble with something that wasn't fear. Mr. Bridger, she said slowly, would you let me look at those papers and the ledgers if you've kept them? I know it isn't my place, and I know you've only known me a handful of days. But I spent 11 years reading contracts and columns for my father's store, and something about a loan calling due, with no warning from the very man who wrote the terms, that doesn't sit right with me at all. Thomas studied her for a long moment, the same weighing look he'd given her that first stormy night, and Margaret understood he was deciding something important. Not just whether to trust her with his books, but whether to let himself hope that the woman who'd shown up starving at his gate might also be the one to save the only home he had left. They're in the study, he said, finally rising from his chair. Come on then. God knows I could use a second pair of eyes that isn't scared to say what it sees. He led her down the hall to a small room crowded with a roll-top desk and stacks of paper that had clearly outgrown every drawer meant to hold them. And there in the gray morning light through a single window, Thomas Bridger pulled out 4 years of ledgers and laid them in front of Margaret Doyle like a man laying down his last card in a game he'd already half decided he was going to lose. Margaret sat down, pulled the first ledger toward her, and opened it. It took her less than 10 minutes to find the first thing wrong. This entry, she said, tapping a line with her finger. Cattle sale autumn before last. You sold 210 head. The ledger shows payment for 180. That sounds about right. Prices were down that season. No, sir. I mean, the contract says 210 sold at the price agreed, and the payment received column shows a number consistent with only 180. Somebody either miscounted your herd or miscounted your money, and I'd wager good coin it wasn't the herd that got miscounted. She flipped forward several pages, her pulse quickening the way it used to when she caught a supplier shorting her father back home. Here, same pattern the following spring, and here again. Every large sale a gap between what should have been paid and what actually arrived, never large enough on any single occasion to raise an alarm, but added together over 4 years. She stopped, did the arithmetic twice in her head to be certain, and looked up at Thomas with an expression that made him go pale before she'd even said the number. Mr. Bridger, by my count, you have been shorted somewhere in the neighborhood of $11,000 over the past 4 years, and every one of those sales went through the same buyer's office. The color drained further from Thomas's face. Crane's office handles all the big sales in this territory. Ain't hardly a rancher for 50 miles who don't sell through him. Then I'd wager you're not the only man he's doing this to. Margaret closed the ledger slowly, her mind already racing 3 steps ahead, the way it used to race when she found the thread of a lie in her father's accounts and had to decide how far to pull it before it broke. Mr. Bridger, I don't think this loan calling due is bad luck at all. I think somebody wants your land, and I think he's been quietly starving your ranch of money for years to make sure that when the moment came, you wouldn't have the funds to fight back. Thomas sat down slowly across from her, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything at all. The only sound, the soft tick of rain returning against the window glass. You're telling me, he said finally, that the woman who walked up to my gate a week ago asking for scraps Just found the thing that's been killing this ranch when I couldn't find it in 4 years of looking. I'm telling you, I think I found where to start looking harder, Margaret said. There's a difference. I don't have proof yet. I have a pattern, and patterns aren't proof, not in a court of law, and not against a man with Crane's money and reputation behind him. If we're going to fight this, we need every contract, every bill of sale, every signature he's ever put in front of you, and we need to go through it line by line until the pattern becomes something nobody can argue away. Thomas looked at her, really looked at her in a way that made Margaret's breath catch in her throat, and something passed between them that neither of them had a name for. Yet something built out of gratitude and astonishment, and the dawning dangerous hope that maybe together they stood a chance against a man who had never once in his life expected to be caught. Then we'd best get started, he said. Because if what you're saying is true, we've got 6 weeks to prove it, or I lose this ranch to the very man who's been robbing it blind. Margaret pulled the next ledger toward her, rolled up her sleeves, and did not look up again for a long while. They worked through the morning and into the afternoon, Margaret calling out figures, and Thomas cross-referencing them against old bills of sale pulled from a trunk in the corner. The two of them falling into an easy rhythm that surprised them both. She'd point to a discrepancy. He'd remember the circumstance around that particular sale, and together they began to reconstruct a pattern that had been hiding in plain sight for years, disguised as bad luck and worse markets. It was Silver Jack who interrupted them near supper time, knocking once on the study door frame before letting himself in, his weathered face grim. "Boss." He held his hat in both hands, twisting the brim. "Ryder just came up from town. Says Crane's coming out here himself tomorrow. Says he wants to discuss the loan in person." Thomas and Margaret exchanged a look loaded with everything they'd just uncovered. "Did the Ryder say what time?" Thomas asked. "Noon, boss. Said Crane wants to see the ranch's books, make sure everything's in order before he decides on an extension." Margaret's stomach dropped. "He wants to see the ledgers tomorrow." "That's what the man said, ma'am." Thomas looked at the stacks of papers spread across the desk, 4 years of quiet theft laid bare between them, and something hardened in his jaw that Margaret hadn't seen there before. Not the tired resignation of a man who'd accepted bad luck, but the cold, focused anger of a man who'd just realized he'd been made a fool of in his own house for years. "Let him come," Thomas said quietly. "Let him see whatever he wants to see. But Margaret's staying in this room while he does, and she's staying at that table when he sits down to talk business, whether Silas Crane likes the look of that or not." Silver Jack's eyebrows rose slightly, the closest thing to surprise Margaret had yet seen cross his stony face, but he only nodded once and withdrew, leaving the two of them alone with the ledgers and the rain, and the sudden, sharp understanding that whatever peace they'd found in the past week was about to be tested by a man who had never once lost a fight he'd started. "Are you certain?" Margaret asked quietly. "Having me at the table, a woman and a housekeeper besides it, might only give him more reason to underestimate what we know. Men like that often talk more freely in front of someone they've already dismissed." Something that might have been the ghost of a smile crossed Thomas's tired face. "Miss Doyle, in the 1 week I've known you, you've fed 6 hungry men better than they've eaten in a year, mended enough shirts to reclothe half the county, and found a theft that's been bleeding this ranch dry for 4 years while I sat here blind to it. If Silas Crane wants to underestimate you, I'll not be the man who talks him out of it. Let him walk into that room tomorrow thinking he's facing a rancher and his housekeeper." He met her eyes steady and sure. "He's about to find out he's facing something else entirely." Margaret held his gaze, and for the first time since the stones had struck her outside the mercantile in Miller's Creek, she did not feel like a burden the world could barely tolerate. She felt like exactly what she was, a woman who had spent her whole life being underestimated, about to make that mistake cost a very dangerous man everything. Outside, the rain kept falling steady against the window, and somewhere out on the dark road that led toward town, a black buggy with silver fittings sat waiting in a barn for morning, its owner already certain of how tomorrow's meeting would end, with no notion at all of the woman who had arrived at Stone Creek Ranch a week before, asking only for scraps, and who was now the one thing standing between Silas Crane and everything he had spent 4 patient years stealing. Morning brought no relief from the rain, only a thinning of it into a mist that clung low over the pastures. And Margaret spent the hours before noon doing the only thing she knew how to do, with fear she worked. She had the house scrubbed top to bottom by 10, a pot of coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in ready by 11, and every ledger, every bill of sale, every scrap of paper she and Thomas had gathered, organized into a stack on the study desk, with a precision that would have made her father proud. God rest him wherever he'd ended up. Thomas found her there at 11:30, straightening a stack of papers that did not need straightening. "You don't have to sit in on this," he said quietly, leaning in the doorway. "I meant what I said last night, but I'll not force you into a room with a man like Crane if it troubles you." Margaret looked up at him, and something in her spine had gone straight and sure since the night before, the fear of it burned away by a colder, harder thing. "Mr. Bridger, I have spent my whole life being talked over, talked around, and talked down to by men who thought a woman my size had nothing worth saying. I intend to sit in that chair, and I intend to say exactly what these numbers tell me. And if Silas Crane doesn't care for the sound of it, that is a trouble he has earned for himself." Something warm flickered behind the worry in Thomas's eyes. "Well then, I suppose we're ready for him." The buggy came up the road at 5 minutes past noon, black lacquer catching what little light the mist allowed, silver fittings on the harness, winking like small cold stars. Margaret watched it come from the study window, and something about the unhurried pace of it, a man in no rush at all, certain of his welcome, certain of his outcome, set her teeth on edge before she'd even seen his face. Silas Crane stepped down from the buggy with the careful movements of a man who had never once in his life climbed down into mud he hadn't paid someone else to clear first. He was tall, silver at the temples, dressed finer than any man had cause to dress for a ranch call, and he smiled the way certain men smiled when they had already decided how a conversation would end before it began. "Thomas." He extended a gloved hand at the door, and Thomas shook it with the flat, unwelcoming grip of a man doing only what manners strictly required. "Good to see the place still standing. Been a hard season for a lot of outfits round here." "Come in out of the wet, Silas. We've business to discuss." Crane's eyes found Margaret the moment he stepped through the door, and Margaret watched the assessment happen in real time, the quick, dismissive sweep from her face to her frame, and back the flicker of something between amusement and contempt, settling into his expression like a man deciding a stray dog wasn't worth the trouble of shooing off. "And who is this?" he asked, not unkindly, which was somehow worse than if he had been. "Margaret Doyle," Thomas said before Margaret could answer for herself. "My housekeeper. She'll be joining us." "Joining us." Crane's mouth curved indulgent, the way a man smiles at a child who has said something he finds amusing rather than worth answering. "Thomas, I don't believe household staff generally sit in on matters of loans and collateral." "She's not sitting in," Thomas said evenly. "She's sitting at the table. There's a difference, and you'll find it out shortly." Crane's smile didn't waver, but something behind his eyes sharpened, recalibrating. He inclined his head toward Margaret with exaggerated courtesy. "Miss Doyle. Charmed, I'm sure." "Mr. Crane." Margaret kept her voice level, kept her spine straight, kept her hands folded in front of her, the way she had learned to hold them when she wanted a room to underestimate exactly how still and exactly how sharp she could be. "Won't you sit down? There's coffee if you'd like it." They settled at the study desk, Crane taking the chair across from Thomas, with the easy confidence of a man who'd sat across 100 desks and won every negotiation at every one of them. He drew a leather folder from his coat and laid it open. Papers crisp and official. A man's whole future reduced to language dense enough that most ranchers never bothered reading past the first paragraph. "The terms are quite clear, Thomas," he said, tapping the page. "Loan comes due in full 6 weeks from yesterday's notice. I know it's sudden, and believe me, I take no pleasure in it, but the bank has obligations of its own investors back east breathing down my neck about outstanding accounts. If you can raise the capital, we're square business as usual. If you can't," he spread his hands apologetic, "the north pasture and water rights transfer to the bank as collateral exactly as you agreed 4 years ago." "Funny thing about that agreement," Thomas said. "I don't recall a 6-week call provision. I recall a standard note same as every rancher in this territory signs with you." It's all there in the fine print, I assure you. Crane's smile didn't move. Section 4, paragraph 2. You're welcome to read it yourself. I intend to, Thomas said. But before we get to reading fine print, Silas, I think you ought to hear what Miss Doyle found in my ledgers this week. For the first time, something flickered across Silas Crane's composed face. Not fear, not yet, but the faint, involuntary tightening of a man who had not expected the conversation to bend in this particular direction. Miss Doyle, he said, his tone carrying just enough condescension to make the words sting on purpose. Handles household matters, I'm sure. Ranch business is best left to men who understand it. Margaret did not raise her voice. She had learned long ago that raising her voice only gave men like this an excuse to stop listening. Mr. Crane, in the autumn before last, Stone Creek Ranch sold 210 head of cattle through your office at the agreed price. The ledger records payment for 180. She opened the ledger in front of her, turned it to face him, and set one finger beneath the entry. That is not the only such discrepancy. I count 11 separate instances across 4 years, every one of them routed through your office, every one of them a gap between what should have arrived and what actually did. Taken together, Mr. Bridger has been shorted somewhere near $11,000. The room went very quiet. Even the rain outside seemed to hold itself still. Silas Crane's eyes moved from the ledger to Margaret's face and back again, and for one long moment, the confident mask slipped just far enough for Margaret to see the calculation happening underneath it, a man rapidly reassessing an opponent he had walked in, already certain he'd already beaten. Bookkeeping errors happen, he said finally, voice smooth again, though not quite as smooth as before. Clerical mistakes. I'll have my office look into it, of course, straighten out any discrepancies. 11 separate clerical mistakes, Margaret said. Every single one in your favor, never once in Mr. Bridger's. That's a curious kind of bad luck, Mr. Crane. In my experience, an honest error corrects itself in both directions eventually. This pattern only ever moved one way. Are you accusing me of theft, Miss Doyle? Crane's voice had gone cold now. All pretense of courtesy stripped away, and Margaret felt Thomas go rigid beside her, ready to stand between them if this turned the way such conversations sometimes turned with men who didn't like being caught. Margaret did not flinch. She had been called worse things by lesser men, and she had survived every one of them. I'm telling you what the numbers say, she answered, steady as still water. I leave the accusing to whoever decides to look into it properly. But I'll tell you plainly, Mr. Crane, that a loan calling due with no warning from the very office that has been quietly shorting this ranch for 4 years strikes me as considerably less like bad luck and considerably more like a plan. Crane rose from his chair so fast it scraped hard against the floorboards, and for one taut second, Margaret thought he might actually strike the desk, or worse. But he only gathered his folder with hands that were not quite steady, tucking it back inside his coat with the brittle composure of a man holding onto his temper by a single fraying thread. You have 6 weeks, Thomas, he said, voice tight. I'd advise you to spend them raising capital rather than letting your housekeeper play accountant with numbers she doesn't fully understand. Some patterns, Miss Doyle, are simply the ordinary cost of doing business in hard times. I'd hate to see a man lose his ranch because he let sentiment cloud good sense. Sentiment, Thomas repeated, standing now himself, tall and unmoving as a fence post. Is that what you'd call a woman finding the truth, Silas Sentiment? Crane didn't answer that. He settled his hat low over his eyes, gave Margaret one last look that carried no courtesy, left in it at all, and walked out through the rain to his waiting buggy. Without another word, the silver fittings on the harness catching the gray light as he drove away faster than he'd arrived. Thomas stood at the window until the buggy had disappeared down the road, his jaw tight, his hands curled into loose fists at his sides. That went about as well as I expected, he said finally. Which is to say, not well at all, but I don't believe I've ever enjoyed a conversation more. Margaret let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, her hands trembling now that the danger of the moment had passed, adrenaline draining out of her all at once. He's going to come after us harder now. Men like that don't take being caught lying down. No, Thomas agreed grimly. They don't. He turned from the window, and something in his face had shifted since the night she'd arrived at his gate. The tired resignation gone, replaced by something sharper, something that looked for the first time in a long while like a man who believed he had a fighting chance. "But we've got 6 weeks and proof he didn't expect us to have. That's more than I had yesterday morning." Margaret closed the ledger slowly, her mind already working ahead to what came next, to every contract they'd still need to gather, every witness who might have been shorted the same way, every thread that might, pulled hard enough, unravel 4 years of careful, patient theft. She did not yet know how far Silas Crane would go to protect what he'd built, or how much it would cost the people of Stone Creek Ranch before this was over. She only knew, watching the last of the buggy's dust settle on the empty road, that the woman who had knelt in the mud a week ago, begging for scraps, was gone. And in her place stood someone Silas Crane had made the gravest mistake of his career in underestimating. Behind her, Thomas Bridger gathered the ledgers back into their stack, his hands steady now, his voice quiet and certain. "We're going to need every one of these," he said. "And we're going to need to talk to every rancher within 50 miles who's ever sold a single steer through that man's office. Because if he's done this to me, Margaret, I'd wager my life he's done it to half this territory, and none of them know it yet." Margaret looked up at him, at the ranch beyond the window, that had in the space of 7 days become the first place in years she'd dared to think of as home, and felt something settle into place inside her that she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember. Not hunger, not fear, not the old familiar ache of being unwanted, but purpose, solid and sure beneath her feet. "Then we'd better start writing letters tonight," she said, "because 6 weeks is not very long at all, and Silas Crane does not strike me as a man who waits patiently to lose." Margaret sat at the study desk long after the last lamp elsewhere in the house had gone dark. A fresh sheet of paper in front of her, and Thomas's borrowed pen, scratching steady lines across it, because sleep felt like a luxury neither of them had 6 weeks to spare. "You don't have to do this tonight," Thomas said from the doorway, still dressed, his own eyes red-rimmed with the same exhaustion pulling at hers. "Letters'll keep till morning. Letters will keep. Silas Crane won't." Margaret didn't look up from the page. "Every hour we wait is an hour he spends deciding how to come at us next, and I'd rather be a step ahead of a man like that than a step behind." Thomas crossed the room and set a fresh cup of coffee at her elbow without being asked, and something in the small, quiet gesture made Margaret's chest ache in a way she didn't have time to examine. "Who were you writing to first?" "Every rancher within riding distance who's ever sold cattle through Crane's office." She dipped the pen again. "If he's done this to you, he's done it to others. Men don't build fortunes like his on $11,000 taken from one honest fool. They build them on hundreds of thousands taken from dozens of men, too proud, too busy, or too trusting to check the arithmetic. And if nobody answers, if every man in this territory's too scared of Crane to put his name to a letter..." Margaret finally looked up, and there was something steel-bright in her eyes that hadn't been there a week before, when she'd knelt shaking in the mud outside his gate. "Then we ride to them ourselves, Mr. Bridger, and we ask them face to face. Fear's a powerful thing, but it isn't stronger than a man's love for the land he spent his whole life building. Somebody out there is going to be angry enough to talk. We only need to find him." They rode out together 3 days later, after the last letter had gone unanswered, and the silence itself had told them everything they needed to know about how deep the fear of Silas Crane ran through the territory. Their first stop was the Kessler spread 20 miles north, where a broad-shouldered rancher named Warren Kessler met them at his gate with a shotgun loosely cradled, and eyes that narrowed the moment Thomas said Crane's name. "You come out here to talk about that thief?" Kessler said. "You'd best come inside where the wrong ears can't hear it." Inside, over coffee gone cold, from nerves nobody touched, Kessler laid out a story that made Margaret's stomach turn. 3 years of shorted payments, a note called due without warning. 40 acres of his best grazing land signed over to the bank before he'd fully understood what he was losing. He'd never questioned it. He'd never had anyone to help him question it. "I figured it was bad luck," Kessler said, bitter. "Figured that's just how ranching goes some seasons. Didn't have nobody to tell me different." "You have someone now," Margaret said, and set her own ledgers on his table beside his, the two sets of numbers lining up in a pattern too precise to be coincidence, too damning to be denied. Kessler's jaw went tight as he studied the columns, and when he finally looked up, something had shifted behind his eyes. Grief for what he'd already lost and something harder rising up underneath it. "I'll put my name to whatever paper you need," he said. "Man's been laughing at me for 3 years thinking I was too dumb to notice. I want him to know I noticed." That was the first mini-victory, but it was not the last, nor the hardest one. 2 days after that, they found Abigail Foss, a widow in her 60s, running her late husband's ranch alone, with 2 hired hands and a grief she wore like a second skin. And her story was worse than Kessler's. By a wide margin, Crane's office had shorted her payments for 5 years running, then called her loan, due the same season her husband died, when she was least able to fight it, and taken 60 acres of prime bottomland while she was still burying him. "I wrote to a lawyer once," Abigail said, her hands trembling around a chipped teacup. "Man wrote back saying he couldn't take the case without a retainer I didn't have. I gave up after that. Figured the Lord wanted me humbled losing my Samuel and my land in the same season." "The Lord didn't take your land, Mrs. Foss," Margaret said, gently reaching across the table to still those trembling hands. "Silas Crane took it, and grief made you too tired to fight him for it. That's not humility. That's cruelty dressed up as bad luck, and I intend to see it named for what it is." Abigail Foss wept. Then the first real tears Margaret had seen from her. And when she finally spoke again, her voice had steadied into something Margaret recognized, the sound of a woman remembering she still had fight left in her. "Tell me what you need from me," she said. "I'll give it." By the time they turned their horses back toward Stone Creek 4 days later, they had 5 signed statements, 3 sets of corroborating ledgers, and a pattern so wide and so damning that even a judge inclined to favor a wealthy banker would struggle to wave it away. Margaret rode beside Thomas in a silence that felt for the first time in longer than she could remember, like something close to hope. That hope lasted exactly as long as it took to crest the last hill above the ranch. Thomas pulled his horse up hard, and Margaret followed his gaze to the north pasture fence line, where a full section of rail had been torn down and scattered. And beyond the gap, cattle were spread wide across open range that had no business being open, drifting toward the tree line and the ravine beyond it. "Son of a—" Thomas was already spurring his horse down the slope before he finished the thought, and Margaret rode hard behind him, her heart hammering with a fear that had nothing to do with the danger of loose cattle, and everything to do with what a torn-down fence this soon after Crane's visit was almost certainly meant to say. They found Otis and Ezra already in the pasture working desperately to turn the herd before full dark. And the moment Otis spotted Thomas, he shouted across the distance with a fury Margaret had never heard from the steady foreman before. "Fence didn't fall, boss. Somebody cut it. Cut it clean with wire snips, 3 separate places, and rode off before Silver Jack caught sight of 'em." Thomas's face went the color of ash. "How many head we lost? Won't know till we get a full count, but it's bad. Some already down in the ravine. Might have broke legs on the rocks down there in the dark." For the next 2 hours, Margaret worked alongside the men in a way she never imagined a housekeeper would. Holding lanterns, calming panicked animals, with a low, steady voice she hadn't known she possessed. Helping Silverjack splint the foreleg of a young steer that had gone down hard on the rocks. Her hands were raw and shaking by the time they finally had the herd contained back behind a hastily mended stretch of fence. And when she finally straightened her back to breathe, she found Thomas standing beside her, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite name. "You didn't have to do any of that," he said quietly. "I did, actually." Margaret wiped her hands on her ruined apron. "This is my home too, Mr. Bridger, whether I've earned the right to call it that yet or not. I wasn't about to stand in the yard wringing my hands while your herd scattered into a ravine." Something in Thomas's face cracked open, then raw and unguarded, in a way she hadn't seen from him since that first night at the door. And for one long moment, neither of them said anything at all. The lantern light throwing soft shadows between them while the night settled cold around the ranch. "Margaret." He started and stopped and started again. I don't rightly know how to say what I'm feeling right now, except that a week ago, I was a man drowning quiet in his own ranch, and tonight I'm standing here with cut fences and scattered cattle, and a woman half frozen and covered in mud, and somehow I've never felt less alone in my life." Margaret's breath caught. Before she could find words to answer him, Silver Jack's voice cut through the dark, urgent and grim. "Boss, you'd best come see this." He led them to the fence line itself, to the spot where the wire had been cut clean, rather than snapped by weather or wear, and there, driven into a fence post with a hunting knife, was a folded scrap of paper that had clearly been left where it couldn't be missed. Thomas pulled the knife free and unfolded the note with hands that had gone very still. He read it once in silence. Then he handed it to Margaret without a word. 3 lines written in a hand disguised to look rougher than it likely was. "Some fences ain't worth mending. Some fights ain't worth winning. Sell now while you still got something left to sell." Margaret's blood went cold. This isn't a rustler's warning. Rustlers don't leave notes. This is Crane telling us he knows exactly what we found at Kessler's and Foss's places, and he's telling us to stop before we go any further. "Then he's more scared than he's letting on," Thomas said grimly, though his jaw was tight enough that Margaret could see the fear underneath the resolve. "Man doesn't threaten unless he's worried the ground's shifting under him." They rode back to the house in silence, the note tucked into Thomas's coat pocket like a coal too hot to hold, but too important to drop. And it was well past midnight by the time the ranch finally settled into an uneasy quiet. Every hand posted in shifts to watch the fence line for the rest of the night. Margaret couldn't sleep. She sat at the kitchen table with a lamp burning low, turning the events of the day over and over, and she was still sitting there when Thomas came down, sometime near 2 in the morning, unable to sleep himself. "You should rest," he said, settling into the chair across from her, the same chair he'd sat in that first stormy night when she'd been a stranger begging at his door. "So should you." She managed a tired half-smile. "Seems neither of us is very good at taking our own advice." Thomas studied her for a long moment in the low lamplight, and when he spoke again, his voice had gone quieter, more careful than she'd heard it before. "I keep thinking about something you said that first night, about Miller's Creek, about men deciding a woman's worth before they ever bothered learning her name." He rubbed a thumb along the rim of his coffee cup. "I want you to know I've been thinking on the opposite of that too. About what a man learns about a woman's worth once he does bother, once he watches her hold a lantern steady over a hurt animal at midnight, or stare down a man like Crane without so much as a tremor in her voice." Margaret's throat tightened. "Mr. Bridger." "Thomas," he corrected softly. "I think we're well past Mr. Bridger, don't you?" She held his gaze, feeling something warm and terrifying unfurl in her chest, a feeling she had spent years convincing herself she wasn't allowed to want. "Thomas," she said, testing the shape of his name in her mouth for the first time. "I think we passed that a while back, yes." Neither of them moved to close the distance between them. That night, there was too much danger pressing in at the edges of the ranch. Too much unfinished fear from the cut fence and the note driven into the post for either of them to give in fully to whatever was growing between them. But something had shifted, all the same, settled into place quiet and certain. And when Margaret finally climbed the stairs to her room near dawn, she carried it with her like a warm coal cupped careful in her hands. The morning brought no rest from trouble. Thomas rode into town before sunup to file a formal report of the cut fence with the sheriff's office, and Margaret went with him, determined to see for herself what kind of man wore the badge in a territory where Silas Crane's money reached as far as it apparently did. Sheriff Elias Grady was a heavy-set man with tired eyes and a mustache gone gray before its time, and he listened to Thomas's account of the cut fence and the note with a carefulness that struck Margaret as more performance than genuine concern. "Rustlers cut fences all the time, Bridger," Grady said, not quite meeting either of their eyes. "Ain't necessarily connected to Crane just because you two got some notion in your heads about his ledgers." "The note said sell now, Elias," Thomas said, voice tight with barely leashed frustration. "Rustlers after beef don't leave notes telling a man to sell his land." "I'll look into it." Grady's tone made clear exactly how thoroughly he intended to look into anything at all. Best thing you can do, meanwhile, is keep your hands close to the herd and your nose out of business. That ain't yours, if you take my meaning. Margaret stepped forward before Thomas could answer, her voice cool and precise. Sheriff Grady, are you telling us not to pursue evidence of fraud because it might inconvenience Mr. Crane? Grady's eyes flicked to her, and for the first time something like wariness crossed his tired face. I'm telling you, ma'am, that Silas Crane sits on the town council funds, half the buildings on Main Street, and ain't a man whose business gets questioned lightly around here. You'd do well to remember that before you go stirring up trouble you can't finish. We intend to finish it, Margaret said, with or without your help, Sheriff. I only hope when the truth comes out, you'll be able to say you did your duty rather than looked away from it. They left the sheriff's office with nothing gained but confirmation of exactly how deep Crane's influence ran, and the walk back to the wagon took them past the Mercantile, the very same one where less than 2 weeks before, Margaret had been laughed out the door and pelted with stones. She felt her stomach tighten as they passed Old Fear, rising sharp and sudden. But this time, Thomas's hand found the small of her back steady and sure, and he did not hurry her past the storefront the way she half expected. He slowed instead deliberately, and looked through the window at the very man who had humiliated her. The Mercantile owner, a narrow man named Purdy, looked up and went pale at the sight of them. Mr. Purdy, Thomas said, loud enough to carry through the open door, loud enough for the 3 customers inside to hear every word. I understand you had some words for Miss Doyle here a couple weeks back. Something about her size and what kind of work a woman like her was fit for. Purdy's mouth worked without sound for a moment. Didn't mean nothing by it, Bridger, just, you meant every word of it, Thomas said, same as the men who threw stones at her cart meant every stone. I want you to look at her now. Purdy, and I want you to tell me plain, does this look like a woman fit only for sweeping floors and taking scraps? Because this is the same woman who just found $11,000 of fraud hiding in my ledgers, the same woman half this territory's about to owe a debt of gratitude to before this is through. The customers inside had gone silent, watching. Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks, not from shame this time, but from something entirely new. The astonishing sensation of being defended loudly and publicly by a man who clearly did not care who heard him do it. Purdy mumbled something that might have been an apology and found sudden urgent business behind his counter. Thomas didn't wait for more than that. He simply took Margaret's arm, gentle and certain, and walked her back to the wagon with his head high, and Margaret walked beside him with her own head higher than it had been in years. You didn't have to do that, she said once they were out on the road again, the town shrinking behind them. I know. Thomas kept his eyes on the road, but there was a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Wanted to anyway. They rode home in a silence that felt lighter than any silence Margaret had known in years, and she allowed herself for just a little while to believe that maybe the worst of it was behind them, that they had allies. Now evidence, now a growing wall of proof that even a man like Silas Crane couldn't argue away forever. That fragile hope lasted until they turned up the ranch road and saw Silver Jack running toward them on foot, hat gone, face white as bone. Boss! His voice cracked across the distance. Boss, you need to come quick. It's Ezra. He's hurt bad out by the North Ravine. He went down after them cattle in the dark 2 nights back, and something ain't right with his leg. It swelled up something fierce, and he's burning with fever. Thomas didn't wait for the wagon to fully stop before he was down and running, and Margaret was only a step behind him, her mind already racing through everything she knew about wounds gone bad, about fever and swelling, and the terrible speed with which infection could take a young man's life if it wasn't caught in time. They found Ezra in the bunkhouse, his leg wrapped in a filthy bandage someone had tied too tight days ago and never checked again. His face flushed dark with fever, his breathing shallow and fast. Margaret knelt beside him and peeled back the bandage with careful hands, and the smell that rose up told her everything she needed to know before she even saw the wound itself. This has gone bad, she said, her voice tight with controlled urgency. It's infected deep, and it's been left too long. We need clean water whiskey if you have it, and every clean cloth in this house now. Is he going to lose the leg? Thomas's voice had gone rough with a fear Margaret hadn't heard from him even at Crane's visit. "I don't know yet." She was already working cleaning the wound with hands that shook only slightly, drawing on memories of tending her own father through his last long illness, on every scrap of knowledge she'd gathered nursing sick neighbors back in the town she'd left behind. "But I intend to fight for it, and I need every man in this room to help me, rather than hover." For the next several hours, the ranch narrowed down to a single fight. Margaret cleaning and packing the wound. Thomas holding Ezra steady through the pain. Otis and Dutch and Carl running for water and clean linens, and anything else Margaret called for. Silverjack sitting silent at the young man's head, murmuring low words of comfort in a language Margaret didn't recognize, but understood perfectly all the same. Near dawn, the fever finally broke, and Ezra's breathing evened out into something like real sleep, and Margaret sat back on her heels exhausted down to her bones, her hands stained and her dress ruined beyond any hope of mending. Thomas found her there a few minutes later, sitting alone on the bunkhouse steps, watching the sky begin to lighten gray toward morning. "You saved his leg," he said quietly, sitting down beside her. "Maybe his life. We saved it together." Margaret leaned her head back against the doorframe, too tired to hold herself as carefully upright as she usually did. "This ranch is bleeding, Thomas. Cut fences scattered cattle, a boy nearly losing his leg because everyone was too stretched thin to notice a bandage tied wrong. Crane's not just stealing your money. He's grinding down everyone who depends on this place a little at a time, hoping the weight of it breaks something before we can prove what he's done." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, watching the horizon. "Then we don't let it break," he said finally. "Whatever it costs. We don't let him win this." Margaret turned to look at him, and something passed between them in the pale gray light, exhaustion and fear, and underneath it all, a fierce and stubborn hope neither of them was willing to name aloud yet. "No," she agreed softly. "We don't." They had barely a day to recover before the next blow landed. A rider came up the road 2 mornings later carrying an envelope with the bank's seal pressed into red wax. And when Thomas broke it open at the kitchen table, his face went slowly, terribly still. "What is it?" Margaret asked, though some cold certainty in her stomach already knew the answer wouldn't be good. "Crane's filed a petition with the territorial court," Thomas said, reading the dense legal language twice before he trusted himself to summarize it aloud. "Says he has reason to believe I'm concealing assets and falsifying my own books to avoid repayment. Says he's requesting the loan be accelerated immediately, full amount due within 2 weeks instead of 6 on account of what he's calling. And I'm reading this exact fraudulent conduct and material misrepresentation by the debtor." Margaret's blood went cold. "He's accusing you of the very thing he's guilty of. Turning our own evidence against us before we can even present it. 2 weeks. Thomas set the letter down with hands that had begun to shake, not from fear this time, but from a fury so deep it had gone past heat into something colder and more dangerous. 2 weeks, Margaret, to raise money I don't have or prove fraud against a man who just told the whole territorial court I'm the one who's lying. Margaret stood very still, her mind racing through every scrap of evidence they'd gathered, every signed statement, every ledger, weighing it all against the terrible new weight of 2 weeks instead of 6. Outside, the morning had turned gray again, clouds building slow over the mountains, the way they had the night she'd first come stumbling up this very road with nothing but a cloth bag and a lifetime of rejection behind her. "Then we ride to the territorial capital ourselves," she said finally, her voice steady, even as her heart hammered hard against her ribs. "And we get there before his petition does, and we make sure that when a judge finally hears this case, he hears our evidence first." Thomas looked at her, something fierce and grateful and frightened all tangled together in his eyes. "That's 4 days' ride, Margaret. Maybe 5, depending on weather. We don't have much room for error. Then we'd best not make any." Margaret was already moving toward the study, already reaching for the satchel of ledgers and statements they'd gathered with so much careful work, her hands steady now, despite everything. "Because Silas Crane just made the mistake of showing us exactly how frightened he is, Thomas. A man that's scared doesn't file a petition like that unless he believes we're close enough to ruin him. We're not backing down now. Not when we're this close to the truth. They left within the hour, packing only what the horses could carry, at a hard, sustained pace. The satchel of ledgers wrapped in oilcloth against the coming rain. A week's worth of hardtack and dried beef blankets rolled tight behind the saddles. Otis argued for sending a hand along as escort, and Thomas refused it flat. "Every man we can spare needs to stay here," Thomas said, checking the cinch on his saddle with hands that moved fast and sure despite the tightness in his jaw. "Ezra's still mending the fence needs watching, and if Crane's desperate enough to file a false petition, he's desperate enough to try something worse while we're both gone. I need every one of you here watching this place like it's the last thing you'll ever guard." "And who's watching you two on the road?" Otis pressed, unconvinced. "Man who cuts fences and leaves knife notes ain't above worse, boss, and you know it." "We'll watch each other," Margaret said, swinging up into the saddle with a determination that startled even herself, given that she hadn't ridden a horse with any regularity in over a decade. "We don't have the luxury of caution right now, Mr. Reyes. We have 13 days before Crane's petition reaches the capital ahead of us, and every hour we spend arguing about escorts is an hour we don't have to spare." Otis looked between the two of them for a long moment, something resigned and fiercely protective in his weathered face, and finally he nodded once sharp. "Then you ride hard, and you ride smart, both of you. This ranch needs you back in one piece a good deal more than it needs you dead heroes." The first 2 days on the road passed without incident. Beyond the ordinary miseries of long hours in the saddle, sore muscles, thin meals eaten cold beside the trail, a night spent huddled under a rock overhang, while rain hammered down around them close enough that Margaret could feel the chill of it, even sheltered as they were. She and Thomas talked more in those 2 days than they had in the 2 weeks before it, combined trading pieces of their lives back and forth, like people finally allowed to set down burdens they'd carried alone too long. She told him about her father's store, about the 11 years she'd spent behind that counter, learning every trick a dishonest supplier might try, about the fire that had taken the store, and within it, the only security she'd ever known. She told him haltingly about the 3 years after towns that wouldn't hire her relatives, who wouldn't house her, the slow grinding erosion of believing herself worth anything at all. Thomas told her about his own losses in turn, a wife dead of fever 6 years back. No children to fill the silence she'd left behind. A decade of building this ranch alone, with nothing but stubbornness and long hours to show for it. He told her about the housekeeper who'd raised him more than his own mother had, about the quiet grief of watching her fade that spring, about the loneliness that had settled into the house afterward, like dust. Nobody bothered clearing. "I stopped expecting anything good to walk up that road," he admitted on the second night, staring into a small fire they'd risked despite the danger of it. "Figured I'd just keep working till the work killed me, same as it near killed her. Then you knocked on my door bleeding and begging for scraps, and I don't rightly know how to explain it, Margaret, except that something in me that had gone quiet a long while woke back up that night." Margaret's throat tightened around words she didn't trust herself to say, yet not with so much danger still ahead of them. Not with a fight for his entire ranch still hanging unresolved. Instead, she reached across the small fire and took his hand, rough and scarred and steady, and held it without saying anything at all. And Thomas held hers back just as tight, and for a little while the danger of the road and the weight of the fight ahead of them both went quiet too. It was on the third day, cresting a ridge overlooking the Long Valley Road that led toward the territorial capital, that they saw the riders waiting below. 3 men mounted, positioned square across the narrow trail where it funneled between a rock face and a steep drop toward the river. Not travelers, not ranch hands going about honest business, but men positioned with the deliberate patience of an ambush. Thomas pulled his horse up hard, one arm flung out to stop Margaret's mount beside him. "That's trouble," he said low. "Ain't no reason for 3 men to sit a trail like that, unless they're waiting on somebody in particular." Margaret's heart began to slam against her ribs. "Waiting on us?" "Maybe." Thomas's eyes swept the terrain, calculating the same cold focus she'd seen in him the day the fence was cut. "There's a game trail cuts up through the timber a half-mile back steeper going, but it'll bring us around the ridge and down the far side, missing that stretch of road entirely. It'll cost us the better part of a day." And if we take the road instead, then we find out real quick whether those men are here to talk or here to make sure we never reach that courthouse at all." Margaret looked down at the three riders, patient and unmoving in the gray afternoon light, and felt the satchel of evidence pressing heavy against her side. 13 days of gathered truth that Silas Crane would clearly do almost anything to keep out of a judge's hands. She thought of Ezra's fevered leg of the note driven into the fence post of Abigail Foss's trembling hands around a chipped teacup, and understood with sudden terrible clarity exactly how much was riding on the two of them getting past this ridge alive. "The timber trail," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "We didn't come this far to gamble everything on finding out the hard way what those men intend." Thomas nodded once, already turning his horse toward the tree line, and Margaret followed him off the road and into the deep timber, her pulse hammering with every snap of a branch beneath the horse's hooves. Every shadow that might, for all she knew, hide a fourth man Silas Crane had thought to post exactly where they'd try to slip around his ambush. They had gone perhaps a quarter-mile into the trees, moving as quiet as two exhausted riders and two tired horses could manage, when somewhere behind them, back toward the road, a man's voice rang out sharp across the valley. Not close enough yet to be certain, but close enough to leave no doubt at all that their detour had not gone entirely unnoticed. "They're up in the timber cut around. Don't let 'em reach the Capitol." Thomas's face went hard as flint. "Ride, Margaret. Ride now, and don't you dare stop for anything until I tell you to." She dug her heels in without hesitation, the satchel of evidence clutched tight against her body, the timber blurring dark and close on either side as her horse lunged forward into a dead run, and somewhere behind them, closing fast through the trees, she could hear the unmistakable sound of other horses giving chase. Branches whipped past Margaret's face hard enough to sting, and she bent low over her horse's neck, the way she'd seen Thomas ride, trusting the animal's instinct over her own to find footing on ground she couldn't clearly see. Behind her, the crash of pursuit through the timber grew louder rather than fainter, and somewhere off to her left a gunshot cracked through the trees, close enough that a branch above her head exploded into splinters. "They're shooting!" she called out, terror sharpening her voice. "Warning shots!" Thomas shouted back, though she could hear the strain in his own voice, the effort of steering his horse through timber at a speed that could break both their necks if either animal misjudged a single route. "They want us stopped. Not dead. Don't explain itself to a judge. Keep riding." The timber began to thin ahead of them, opening onto a rocky slope that dropped steep toward a narrow creek bed, and Thomas didn't slow, didn't hesitate. Simply angled his horse down the slope at an angle that made Margaret's stomach lurch with fear, even as she followed him down it. Gravel skittering loose beneath the horse's hooves, both of them half sliding, half riding down toward the water. They hit the creek bed hard, horses splashing through shallow water, and Thomas cut sharp downstream, following the natural cover of the banks, rising steep on either side, using the terrain itself to break line of sight with whoever was still crashing through the timber above them. For several long minutes, neither of them spoke, riding hard along the water, and slowly, gradually, the sounds of pursuit behind them faded into the ordinary noise of wind and water and their own labored breathing. Thomas finally pulled up in the shelter of an overhanging bank, both horses lathered and blowing hard, and turned to look back the way they'd come, watching, waiting, his hand resting easy but ready near the rifle in his saddle scabbard. "I think we lost them," he said finally, though his voice carried no real relief in it, only a grim, watchful tension. For now. Margaret repeated, her own hands shaking as she finally let herself register how close that shot had come. "Thomas, they were shooting at us. Real bullets, not just a scare. Warning shots into the trees, like I said. If Crane wanted us dead, those men wouldn't have missed by 10 feet. Thomas's jaw was tight, grim calculation working behind his eyes. "He wants us stopped, not dead. A dead rancher and his housekeeper on the road to the Capitol raises questions even Crane's money can't buy away entirely. But stopped, delayed, maybe roughed up enough to think twice about finishing the ride, that's a different matter." Margaret looked down at the satchel still clutched tight against her body, soaked through from the creek crossing, but intact, every ledger and sign statement inside, it's still safe. "Then we finish the ride," she said, steadying her voice through sheer will. We didn't come this far to let 3 of Crane's hired men turn us back with warning shots and a scare. They pressed on through the afternoon and into evening, taking a longer, rougher route that added the better part of a day to their journey, but kept them well clear of the main road, where Crane's men might still be watching, and it was well past dark. Both of them, exhausted, past the point of clear thought, when they finally reached a small way station run by an old trapper named Hollis Greer, who asked no questions and charged fair prices for a meal and a locked room. It was there, over a thin stew Margaret barely tasted, that Thomas finally said the thing that had clearly been sitting heavy on him since the creek bed. "I should have sent you home before this," he said quietly. "Should have made this ride alone. If something happened to you out here because of my fight with Crane, I don't know that I could—" He stopped, his jaw working, unable to finish the thought. Margaret set down her spoon and looked at him steady across the small table. "It stopped being only your fight the moment I opened that first ledger, Thomas. This is my fight too now. My home too. I won't be sent back to wait safe somewhere while you ride into danger alone, not for this, not for anything." Her voice softened just slightly. "Besides, who else is going to explain the numbers to a judge who doesn't know a false entry from an honest one?" A tired, grateful smile pulled at the corner of Thomas's mouth despite everything. "I suppose that's a fair point. It's the only point that matters right now." She reached across the table, and this time neither of them hesitated. His hand found hers and held it, rough palm against rough palm, both of them marked by the same hard week, and for a moment the fear of the road and the men who'd chased them through the timber receded just far enough to let something gentler through. "We're going to see this through together, Thomas. All the way to the end. I need you to trust that." "I do," he said, and the simple certainty in his voice settled something in Margaret's chest that had been trembling since the first gunshot cracked through the timber. "I trust you more than I've trusted anyone in a long while." They reached the territorial capital 2 days later, travel-worn and exhausted, but whole, and the courthouse itself rose up gray and imposing against a sky that had finally cleared after days of rain. A building that had, in Margaret's imagination, during the long ride, taken on the shape of every fear she carried about whether justice truly extended to women like her housekeepers and ranchers up against a man with Crane's money and reputation. The clerk at the courthouse desk, a thin, harried man buried under stacks of filings, informed them that Silas Crane's petition had indeed already been received 3 days prior, and that a hearing had been scheduled for the following morning before Judge Harlan Whitfield. A circuit judge, known the clerk, added in a lowered voice, for having little patience for either side in a dispute and even less patience for wasted time. "You'll want to file your response today if you intend to be heard tomorrow," the clerk said. Judge Whitfield doesn't take kindly to surprises in his courtroom. They spent the remainder of the day preparing exactly that, Margaret organizing every ledger, every signed statement from Kessler and Foss, and 3 other ranchers who'd since come forward, once word spread, laying out the pattern of fraud in language precise enough that even a judge unfamiliar with cattle accounting could follow the thread of it without difficulty. Thomas watched her work with something like awe on his exhausted face. And when she finally set down her pen near midnight, satisfied the response was as strong as she could make it. He took her hand across the small rented room they'd taken and simply held it for a long moment without a word. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said finally, "I want you to know that walking up my road that stormy night was the best thing that ever happened to this ranch. To me." Margaret's eyes burned exhaustion and emotion tangling together until she could barely hold either one back. "Ask me again after tomorrow," she managed, "once we know whether we've saved it or lost it." "I don't need tomorrow to know how I feel about you, Margaret." Thomas's voice had gone low and certain in the lamplight. "Whatever that judge decides, that part isn't in question." She didn't trust herself to answer that, not with so much riding on the coming morning, and so she simply leaned into him instead, letting him wrap one arm around her shoulders. And for a few precious hours in that small rented room, the fear of the courtroom ahead went quiet enough for both of them to finally sleep. Judge Harlan Whitfield's courtroom filled quickly the next morning, word having spread through the small capital that a rancher was accusing the territory's most powerful banker of fraud, and Margaret felt every eye in the gallery land on her the moment she and Thomas took their seats. The assessing dismissive weight of strangers deciding in an instant whether a heavy-set woman in a travel-worn dress belonged in a room like this at all. She had felt that weight 1,000 times before. This time, for the first time in her life, she did not lower her eyes beneath it. Silas Crane arrived precisely on time, immaculate, despite the early hour, flanked by a sharp-featured lawyer named Ambrose Kettering, whose confidence filled the room the moment he walked into it. Crane's eyes found Margaret across the courtroom, and the small, knowing smile that crossed his face made her stomach twist, the smile of a man who still believed, despite everything that he held, every card that mattered. "All rise," the bailiff called, and Judge Whitfield entered, a spare, gray-haired man whose sharp eyes swept the courtroom with a speed that suggested he'd already formed opinions about most of what he was about to hear. "Mr. Kettering," the judge said once the formalities were dispensed with, "your client alleges fraudulent conduct by the defendant. Present your case." Kettering rose smooth and confident, laying out Crane's version of events with practiced precision. A rancher falling behind on payments, growing desperate, and attempting to discredit an honest banker's legitimate business practices, rather than face the consequences of his own financial mismanagement. He produced the original loan document, complete with Thomas's signature at the bottom, and read aloud the 6-week acceleration clause in Section 4, Paragraph 2, exactly as Crane had claimed. "The terms are clear, Your Honor," Kettering said. "Mr. Bridger signed this agreement of his own free will 4 years ago. His current claims of fraud appear quite conveniently only after his loan comes due, a pattern this court has seen before, from debtors seeking any excuse to avoid their obligations." Margaret's hands had gone very still in her lap as Kettering spoke, her eyes fixed not on the lawyer but on the document itself, held aloft for the judge and gallery to see. Something about it nagged at her. Some instinct sharpened by 11 years of reading her father's contracts, and when Judge Whitfield called for the defense to respond, she leaned close to Thomas and whispered urgently, "That document. May I ask to examine it before we respond?" Thomas rose immediately. "Your Honor, if it please the court, my associate would like to examine the original document before we present our response." Judge Whitfield's sharp eyes moved to Margaret with open curiosity. "Your associate, Margaret Doyle, Your Honor," Thomas said. "She's the one who uncovered the pattern of fraud we're here to present. I'd trust her eyes on that paper before I'd trust my own." A ripple of murmurs moved through the gallery, and Margaret felt the weight of dozens of skeptical eyes settle on her once more as she rose and approached the bench. But she kept her spine straight and her hands steady as the bailiff carried the document over for her inspection. She examined it slowly, deliberately, aware of every second of silence stretching through the courtroom, aware of Crane's confident half-smile, still fixed in place across the room. The signature page, the body of the agreement. And then turning to the third page, the one containing Section 4, with its damning acceleration clause, she went very still. "Your Honor," she said, her voice carrying clear and steady across the courtroom, "I'd ask the court's indulgence to compare the paper stock and ink of this third page against the first 2 pages of the agreement." Kettering rose sharply. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular." "I'll allow it," Judge Whitfield said, leaning forward with sudden sharp interest. "Bailiff, bring both counsel forward as well." Margaret laid the pages side by side on the clerk's table, and now that she could examine them together, the difference was unmistakable, even to eyes untrained in such matters. The first 2 pages carried the slightly yellowed cast of paper, aged 4 years. The ink faded to a soft brown black, consistent with the date on the agreement. The third page containing the acceleration clause was subtly but distinctly whiter, the ink darker, blacker, the kind of stark contrast that only became visible when a person knew precisely where to look and troubled themselves to look closely. "This third page," Margaret said loud enough now for the whole courtroom to hear, "was not written at the same time as the first 2. The paper is different. The ink is different. I would ask this court to consider whether this page was inserted into the agreement after Mr. Bridger signed it 4 years ago, which would explain why he has no memory of agreeing to a 6-week acceleration clause he most certainly never consented to." The courtroom erupted into murmurs, and Judge Whitfield banged his gavel twice for order, his sharp eyes now fixed on Silas Crane with an entirely different weight than they'd carried moments before. "Mr. Crane," the judge said, "is there an explanation for this discrepancy?" Crane rose slowly, and for the first time since Margaret had met him, she watched real fear crack through the polished composure he wore like armor. "Your Honor, paper stock varies between printings. Ink batches vary. This is hardly proof of—" "It is not proof alone," Margaret interrupted, and every eye in the room swung back to her. "But it is not the only irregularity in this case, Your Honor. I have here signed statements from 4 other ranchers in the territory whose ledgers show the identical pattern of shorted payments through Mr. Crane's office, 3 of whom also had loans called due. Unexpectedly, always at moments of particular hardship, a death in the family, a bad season, a widow left alone. I have Mr. Bridger's complete financial records showing $11,000 in discrepancies across 4 years, every single one favoring Mr. Crane's office. And I would respectfully suggest that a court unwilling to examine a third page's ink against its neighbors is a court unwilling to examine a pattern that, taken as a whole, tells a story considerably clearer than coincidence." Judge Whitfield sat back slowly in his chair, studying Margaret with an expression that had shifted from curiosity into something closer to genuine respect. "Miss Doyle, is it? You've clearly done considerable work here." "I have, Your Honor. I spent 11 years managing my father's accounts before circumstance brought me to Stone Creek Ranch. I know a false entry when I see one, same as I know a false page when I hold it in my hands." Kettering attempted to regroup, his confidence visibly shaken. "Your Honor, even if we grant some irregularity in the paper, this is a wildly circumstantial case built on the testimony of a housekeeper with no formal training and a rancher facing financial ruin who has every motive to fabricate." "That's quite enough, Mr. Kettering." Judge Whitfield's voice had gone hard. "I've sat this bench 11 years, and I've learned to trust my own eyes over a lawyer's objections when the evidence is laid out plain in front of me. This court is not going to rule on an acceleration clause of questionable provenance without further examination." He turned to the clerk. "I want a handwriting expert brought in to examine this document, and I want testimony taken from every rancher named in Miss Doyle's statements. This hearing is continued 3 days, during which time the original acceleration clause, questionable as it now appears, will not be enforced. Mr. Bridger's loan reverts to its original terms and timeline pending this court's full review." The gavel came down sharp and final, and the courtroom broke into a low roar of conversation. Margaret felt Thomas's hand find hers beneath the table, gripping tight, and when she turned to look at him, his eyes were bright with something that looked, for the first time since she'd met him, like unguarded hope. "3 days, he said low, disbelieving. "Margaret, you just bought us 3 days and knocked that acceleration clause flat on its back in front of a judge who's now looking at Crane like he's something he stepped in." "It's not over," Margaret said, though relief was flooding through her fast enough to make her hands tremble. "He'll fight the handwriting expert. He'll find some way to—" She stopped because across the courtroom, Silas Crane had turned to look at her directly, and the fear that had cracked his composure only minutes before had hardened now into something far more dangerous, a cold, calculating fury that promised this fight was nowhere near finished. Whatever the judge had just ruled. He crossed the courtroom floor toward them before either could move away, Kettering trailing, anxious and unable to stop him, and stopped close enough that Margaret could see the muscle working hard in his jaw. "Clever," Crane said, voice pitched low, meant only for them. "I'll give you that, Miss Doyle. Genuinely clever. But you should know that clever isn't the same as safe, and a man in my position doesn't simply accept a public humiliation and walk away quietly. Is that a threat, Mr. Crane?" Thomas's voice had gone dangerously flat, his hand tightening on Margaret's. "It's a fact." Crane's eyes flicked between them, calculating. "You've bought yourself 3 days, Thomas. I'd think carefully about how you spend them, because I have resources you can't begin to imagine, and I did not build what I've built by losing gracefully to a rancher and his housekeeper." He turned on his heel and strode out of the courtroom without another word, Kettering hurrying after him, and Margaret let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, her whole body trembling now that the immediate danger had passed. "He's going to try something," she said. "Something worse than warning shots in the timber." "Let him try." Thomas's voice had gone hard and certain. "We have 3 days to gather everything else we can find, and a judge who's finally looking at that man the way he ought to have been looked at years ago. I don't intend to waste a single hour of it being afraid." They spent that first day sending urgent letters back to Stone Creek, alerting Otis and the others to stay vigilant and reaching out to the handwriting expert Judge Whitfield had ordered, brought in a meticulous, soft-spoken man named Cornelius Abbott, who examined the disputed third page for the better part of an hour under a jeweler's loupe, before finally looking up with the quiet certainty of a man who dealt in facts rather than opinions. This page was written with a different pen, likely purchased within the past year, on paper milled after the date of the original agreement, Abbott said. "I'd stake my professional reputation on it. This third page was inserted well after the original document was signed." Margaret felt something fierce and triumphant rise in her chest. "Will you testify to that in Judge Whitfield's courtroom?" "I will, Miss Doyle. Facts are facts, whoever they happen to inconvenience." That triumph lasted only until the second evening, when a boy came running to the boarding house where they were staying, breathless and wide-eyed, carrying a telegram that had just arrived from Stone Creek Ranch. Thomas tore it open with hands that had gone suddenly terribly still, and Margaret watched the color drain from his face as he read it. "What is it?" she asked, though some cold certainty already told her the answer wasn't going to be good. "Barns burned," Thomas said, his voice hollow with shock. "Otis says it caught sometime after midnight. They lost feed stores, tacked 2 horses that couldn't be gotten out in time." He looked up at her, and the fury and grief tangled together in his eyes was more frightening than anything Margaret had seen from him yet. "Otis says he found lamp oil poured along the base of the walls before the fire took hold. This wasn't an accident, Margaret. Crane just told us exactly how far he's willing to go." Margaret's stomach dropped straight through the floor. "Is anyone hurt?" "Otis says no, praise God, everyone got out. But Margaret—" Thomas's hands had curled into fists at his sides, the telegram crumpled between his fingers. "I need to ride back. Tonight. I can't sit in a courthouse 3 days from home while Crane burns what's left of my ranch to the ground. And the hearing." Margaret kept her voice steady, though her own heart was hammering hard enough to hurt. "Thomas, if you leave now before Abbott testifies before the judge rules Crane wins by default. He doesn't need to prove anything if you're not here to finish what we started. I know that." Thomas's voice cracked raw with a fear she'd never heard in him before. Not even at the fence line, not even in the timber with bullets cutting through branches overhead. "I know that, and I still can't sit here doing sums on paper while my home burns." Margaret crossed the small room and took both his hands in hers, forcing him to look at her, rather than at the telegram crushed between his fingers. "Then we send someone else. Tonight. A rider who can reach the ranch faster than either of us could, who can help Otis protect what's left, while we finish what we came here to do." She held his gaze steady and certain, even as her own heart broke a little at the pain written plain across his face. "Thomas, I know what that ranch means to you. I know every board of it. But if we leave now, we hand Crane exactly what he wants, and everything we've already survived the fence, the note, the men who chased us through the timber, all of it will have been for nothing." Thomas closed his eyes, jaw working, caught between 2 loves fighting for the same narrow space in his chest. When he finally opened them again, something had settled hard and resolved. "You're right," he said quietly. "God help me, you're right." He turned toward the door. "I'll find a rider tonight who can leave before dawn. Someone fast, someone Otis trusts." They found such a man within the hour, a young courier named Beckett, who made his living carrying urgent messages across the territory, and who agreed for a price that emptied nearly the last of their travel money to ride through the night toward Stone Creek, carrying instructions for Otis to double the watch arm, every hand who could shoot straight and wire back the moment anything more happened. Sleep did not come easily that night for either of them. Margaret lay awake in the narrow boarding house bed, listening to Thomas pace the small room next door, and near midnight, She finally rose, wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, and knocked softly on his door. He opened it, looking like a man who hadn't slept in days, which by that point was nearly true. "Margaret, you should be resting. Tomorrow." I couldn't sleep either. She stepped inside without waiting to be invited in intimacy that would have scandalized her a month before, and now felt like the only sensible thing in a world gone entirely unpredictable. I keep thinking about that ranch, about Ezra's leg and the wildflowers Silverjack left on my windowsill, and Otis defending my honor to a man half his size in my very first week there. Her voice caught. "It became my home faster than I ever thought a place could, Thomas. I understand exactly why you wanted to ride back tonight." Thomas's hand came up gentle to brush a strand of hair back from her face, and the tenderness in the gesture after such a brutal day nearly undid her entirely. "It's not just my home anymore," he said quietly. "Somewhere in these past weeks, Margaret, it became ours. I don't rightly know when that happened, only that it did, and I intend to fight for every board and fence post of it, same as I intend to fight for you." Margaret's breath caught, and this time, with no danger pressing close enough to steal the moment away. She let herself lean into him fully, let his arms come around her, steady and sure. And for a little while, the fear of tomorrow's hearing and the grief of the burned barn both went quiet, replaced by something far gentler, far more certain than either of them had dared to name aloud until now. Morning came, grim and gray, appropriate weather for what awaited them. Judge Whitfield's courtroom filled even fuller than before. Word of the burned barn having somehow already reached the capital ahead of them, whether through honest gossip or Crane's own men hoping to paint Thomas as a man too reckless and too distracted by his own troubles to be trusted, Margaret couldn't say. Cornelius Abbott took the stand first, methodical and unshakable under Kettering's aggressive cross-examination, laying out in precise, damning detail exactly how the third page's paper stock and ink dated to well after the original agreement's signing. Kettering pressed him hard, searching for any crack in his certainty, and found none. "I've examined thousands of documents in 20 years of this work," Abbott said calmly. "I have never been more confident of a finding in my career. This page was inserted after the fact, full stop." Then Warren Kessler took the stand, his broad shoulders squared with a determination Margaret recognized from that first meeting at his gate, and laid out his own story of shorted payments and a loan called due at the cruelest possible moment. Abigail Foss followed, her voice trembling, but unbroken, as she described losing 60 acres of bottomland while still grieving her husband. And by the time she stepped down, Margaret could see something shifting in the gallery, the same skeptical faces that had assessed her that first morning, now watching Silas Crane with open growing suspicion. It was during the final testimony from a nervous young clerk named Pruitt, who had worked in Crane's own office for the past 2 years, that the case finally broke wide open. Kettering had not called him. Judge Whitfield had, on his own authority, having heard through the territorial marshal's office that Pruitt had approached them privately 2 days earlier, terrified, and wanting to confess something he could no longer carry alone. "Mr. Pruitt," Judge Whitfield said, "you may speak freely in this court. Tell us what you know." Pruitt's hands shook visibly as he gripped the rail of the witness stand, his eyes flicking once fearfully toward Silas Crane's cold, furious stare, before he forced himself to look only at the judge instead. "Mr. Crane keeps a second set of ledgers," Pruitt said, voice cracking. "True records separate from what he shows his debtors. I've seen them myself filing papers late at night when I thought the office was empty. He's been skimming payments off nearly every large rancher in this territory for going on 6 years, always small enough not to raise alarm on any single transaction, always time to call loans due whenever a man's most vulnerable. A bad season, a death in the family, an injury that keeps him from working his own books close enough to notice." He swallowed hard. "I kept quiet because I was scared for my position, scared of what a man like Crane could do to me if I talked. But when I heard about the barn burning at Stone Creek Ranch, I couldn't stay quiet anymore. That's not business anymore. That's just cruelty." The courtroom erupted into a roar of noise that took Judge Whitfield nearly a full minute of hard gavel strikes to bring back under control and across the room. Margaret watched Silas Crane's face go through a rapid, terrible transformation. Fury giving way to panic. Panic giving way to a cold, calculating stillness that frightened her more than either. "Your Honor." Kettering began scrambling. "My client would ask for a recess to—" "Your client will remain seated, Mr. Kettering," Judge Whitfield said, his voice iron. "This court has heard sufficient testimony to order an immediate investigation into Silas Crane's banking practices, including a full audit of his private ledgers, and I am hereby issuing a restraining order preventing any foreclosure or collateral seizure against Thomas Bridger or any other rancher named in these proceedings pending that investigation's completion." His sharp eyes fixed on Crane directly. "Mr. Crane, I would also strongly advise you to secure legal counsel of your own, separate from your business interests, because based on what this court has heard today, criminal charges are very much a live possibility." Silas Crane rose slowly from his chair, and for one long, terrible moment, Margaret thought he might simply bolt for the door, but instead he turned, found her eyes across the crowded courtroom, and the look he gave her was so cold, so full of promised retribution, that a chill ran straight through her despite the packed, overheated room. "This isn't finished," he said, quiet enough that only those nearest could hear it before Kettering pulled him firmly toward the exit and out of the courtroom, leaving behind a room still buzzing with astonished, triumphant noise. Thomas gripped Margaret's hand so tight it nearly hurt his face, a mixture of exhausted relief and lingering, unshaken fear. "We won," he said, disbelieving. "Margaret, we actually won." "We won today," Margaret said carefully, watching the door through which Silas Crane had just disappeared. That cold, promising look still burned behind her eyes. "But Thomas, did you see his face? That wasn't a man accepting defeat. That was a man already planning his next move, and we're still a full day's ride from a ranch he's already proven he's willing to burn." Thomas's triumph faded fast into the same grim watchfulness that had carried them through the timber and the ambush and every danger since. "Then we ride for home the moment this courtroom clears," he said. "Because you're right. A man like that doesn't lose gracefully, and I won't rest easy until I know everyone back at Stone Creek is safe behind locked doors." They gathered their satchel of evidence, now vindicated beyond anything either of them had dared hope, when they'd first ridden out with nothing but a pattern of numbers and a desperate hope that someone somewhere would believe them, and made their way out of the courthouse into a gray afternoon that felt, despite everything they'd just survived, heavier with danger than lighter. Because somewhere out on that same road, Silas Crane was already moving, already calculating his next desperate play against two people who had just cost him everything he'd spent 6 patient years building, and neither Margaret nor Thomas yet knew exactly how far a cornered, ruined man was willing to go before this fight finally truly ended. They rode out of the territorial capital within the hour, pushing the horses harder than either of them likely should have, stopping only when the animals themselves demanded it, and the whole long, brutal ride back toward Stone Creek Ranch. Margaret found herself praying in a way she hadn't prayed since her father's funeral. Not for anything grand, just for Otis and Ezra, and Silverjack and Dutch and Carl, for a house still standing, for a fight not yet lost, while they'd been 3 days away, proving it in a courtroom. They reached the ranch road on the evening of the second day, exhausted past the point of clear thought, and the sight that greeted them made Margaret's chest tighten with a mixture of relief and fresh alarm. The barn a blackened, skeletal ruin against the darkening sky, but the house itself standing whole, lamplight glowing warm in the windows, and Otis already striding out to meet them before they'd fully reined in. "Boss, Miss Doyle?" Relief broke plain across his weathered face. "Thank God. We've been watching that road every hour since the fire half-scared Crane's men might try something worse before you got back." "Everyone's accounted for." Thomas swung down from his horse exhaustion, forgotten in his urgency. "Everyone's accounted for. Lost the barn near total lost feed stores and 2 horses, but not a soul hurt, and we've been standing double watch every night since, armed and ready." Otis's jaw tightened. "Ezra's mending well, by the way. Legs healing straight, no more fever. Wanted you to know that first thing." Relief washed through Margaret so fast, her knees nearly buckled with it. And Thomas gripped her elbow, steadying her the same careful way he had that first stormy night, though this time it was gratitude rather than hunger weakening her legs. "And the hearing," Otis pressed, searching both their faces. "Did the judge—" "We won," Thomas said, and something in his voice carried disbelief, still even after 2 full days, to sit with the victory. Restraining order against any foreclosure. Full investigation ordered into Crane's ledgers. His own clerk broke down on the stand and confessed to a second set of books. Otis let out a whoop loud enough to startle the horses, and within minutes, the whole ranch had gathered in the yard despite the late hour. Dutch and Carl grinning wide. Silverjack allowing himself the rare luxury of an actual smile. Ezra hobbling out on a crutch with color back in his face for the first time in weeks. All of them crowding close to hear the full account of the courtroom. Margaret told it plain without embellishment, but even stripped bare of drama, the facts spoke for themselves. The forged page Abbott's testimony. Kessler and Foss standing brave before a judge, young Pruitt's trembling confession that had finally broken the case open entirely. By the time she finished, Dutch had tears standing openly in his eyes that he didn't bother hiding. And Silverjack had crossed the yard to shake her hand with both of his. An act of such uncharacteristic warmth from the silent man that Margaret felt her own eyes sting in response. "You did that," Otis said, shaking his head slow with something like wonder. "Housekeeper walks up the road asking for scraps, and inside of a month she's brought down the most powerful man in the territory. I ain't ever seen the like." "We did it," Margaret corrected gently, though warmth spread through her chest at the recognition all the same. "Every one of you held this place together while we were gone. That barn burning and not one soul hurt, that's because you all stood watch armed and ready exactly the way this ranch needed you to." The celebration that night was small but fierce with relief. Margaret cooking up whatever the depleted pantry could offer, while the men swapped stories of the fire and the fight, and the long, anxious days of waiting. And it was well past midnight before the ranch finally settled into an exhausted, hopeful quiet. Margaret found Thomas alone on the porch afterward, staring out at the ruined shape of the barn, silhouetted black against the stars, and she came to stand beside him without a word, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "It's just wood and nails," he said finally, though his voice carried the particular grief of a man who'd built something with his own hands, watching it reduced to ash. "We'll rebuild it, bigger if the money allows once this settles." "It will allow." Margaret slipped her hand into his, and he held it without hesitation, the gesture as natural now as breathing. "Once the judge orders restitution, and Thomas after what Pruitt confessed, I don't see how he won't. You'll recover every dollar Crane ever took from you, and likely a fair penalty on top of it." "I don't much care about the money anymore," Thomas admitted quietly. "I care about this ranch being safe, about the people on it being safe, about you being safe, Margaret, because that man made it plain in that courtroom he isn't finished, and I won't rest easy till I know exactly what he intends next." They didn't have long to wait for their answer. 3 days later, a rider came up the road at a hard gallop, and Margaret's stomach dropped the moment she recognized the tense, urgent set of his shoulders, even from a distance, not a friendly visitor, but a man carrying news that couldn't wait. It was young Pruitt himself, Crane's former clerk, pale and shaking as he reined in hard. Before the porch, his horse, lathered with the effort of a ride, pushed too fast for too many miles. "Mr. Bridger," he gasped, scrambling down. "You need to know Crane's gone. Skipped town 2 nights back soon as word got out. The marshal's office was moving on the investigation faster than expected. But before he ran, I heard him talking to 2 of his hired men. He said—" Pruitt swallowed hard visibly, struggling with the weight of what he was about to say. "He said he wasn't leaving without making sure Bridger paid for what he'd cost him. Said something about the ranch about making an example, so no other rancher in the territory would ever dare cross him again." Thomas's face went hard as flint. "When did he say this?" "2 nights ago, sir. I don't know where he's headed, or when, but I know Crane well enough to say he don't make idle threats. Man's lost everything he built. A man like that backed into a corner with nothing left to lose." Pruitt shook his head grimly. "I rode out soon as I heard figured you'd want warning. You figured right, and I'm grateful for it. Thomas gripped the young man's shoulder. Otis, get every hand armed and posted. Silverjack, I want eyes on that north ridge. That's the most likely approach if a man wanted to come at this place quiet. The ranch moved fast, into a tense, watchful rhythm, every hand armed and alert. Margaret herself, keeping a loaded shotgun close at hand in the kitchen, despite never having fired one before in her life, determined that if Silas Crane came for this place, he would find it ready, rather than caught unguarded the way the barn had been. 2 days passed in that taut, waiting silence, and Margaret began to hope cautiously that perhaps the threat had been empty bluster from a desperate man already fled the territory. That hope shattered on the third night when Silverjack's sharp whistle cut through the darkness from the north ridge. The signal they'd agreed meant riders approaching and not friendly ones. Thomas was up and moving before the whistle had fully died away, rifle in hand, shouting orders that sent every hand scrambling to their posts. Margaret grabbed the shotgun from beside the kitchen door and followed him out into the yard, her heart hammering hard enough to hurt every instinct screaming at her to run and stay put in equal measure. "Margaret, get inside," Thomas said, low and urgent, not looking away from the dark tree line beyond the yard. "Please, I need to know you're safe behind locked doors." "I'm not hiding while this ranch fights for its life, Thomas." Margaret's voice came out steadier than she felt the shotgun heavy and unfamiliar in her hands. "I've held a lantern over hurt animals, and stood before a judge, and rode through gunfire in the timber. I'm not starting to hide now." There was no time to argue further. 3 riders emerged from the tree line at a slow, deliberate walk, and even in the poor light of a half moon, Margaret recognized the silhouette in front, tall, straight-backed, unmistakable, even stripped of the fine coat and silver-trimmed buggy that had once announced his arrival with such casual menace. Silas Crane had come himself this time, and the 2 men flanking him carried rifles held loose and ready across their saddles. Thomas Bridger. Crane's voice carried sharp across the dark yard, stripped now of every ounce of the smooth courtesy he'd once worn like a second skin. "I've come to finish this properly since your housekeeper's little courtroom theatrics have cost me everything I spent 6 years building. You're not welcome on this land, Silas." Thomas's voice was iron, his rifle raised and steady. "I'd advise you turn around now before this goes somewhere neither of us wants it to go. I'm past caring what either of us wants, Bridger." Crane's laugh carried a raw, unhinged edge that hadn't been there before the sound of a man who had genuinely lost everything and no longer had reason to weigh consequences the way he once had. "I built a fortune in this territory. Respect, position, everything a man works his whole life toward, and a fat housekeeper and a stubborn rancher tore it all down inside of a month. You think I'm simply going to ride off into obscurity and let that stand?" "Call her that again," Thomas said, voice dropping dangerous and low, "and see how this night goes for you." From the shadows near the barn's charred remains, Otis's voice rang out sharp. "Boss, we got you covered from 3 angles. Say the word." Crane's eyes flicked briefly toward the sound, calculating. And Margaret watched something shift behind his cold composure. The recognition, perhaps, that he'd ridden into a yard fully prepared for exactly this confrontation, that the element of surprise he'd clearly counted on was already lost to him. "I didn't come to burn your house down, Bridger," Crane said finally, his voice tight with barely contained fury. "Though God knows the thought crossed my mind more than once these past 3 days. I came to make you an offer. Sign a statement recanting your accusations, sign it before witnesses, and I disappear from this territory forever. You get your ranch back whole, no investigation dragging on for months, no trial dragging both our names through the mud. Refuse and I promise you, Bridger, this fight follows you and everyone on this land for as long as I draw breath." "You're asking me to lie," Thomas said, disbelief plain in his voice. "To protect a man who forged documents, stole from half the ranchers in this territory, and burned my barn to the ground trying to scare us into silence. I'm asking you to be practical." Crane's composure cracked, further desperation bleeding through the last of his cold control. "I have nothing left to lose, Bridger. Nothing. You understand what a man does when he has nothing left to lose." It was Margaret who answered. Stepping forward despite Thomas's sharp protective glance, the shotgun steady in her hands, even as her heart hammered fit to burst from her chest. "He does exactly what you're doing right now, Mr. Crane," she said, her voice carrying clear and unshaken across the tense yard. "He shows up in the dark with hired guns to threaten a family who's already beaten him fair because he can't stand the thought of losing to people he spent his whole life believing were beneath him. But here's the thing you haven't understood yet, not once in this entire fight." She took another step forward, ignoring Thomas's low, urgent warning beside her. "We were never afraid of losing everything, Mr. Crane, because neither of us had much of anything to begin with. I arrived at this ranch with a cloth bag and a lifetime of rejection. Thomas built this place up from nothing with his own 2 hands after burying a wife and a housekeeper who was more mother to him than his own. We know how to survive with nothing. You don't. And that's exactly why you're going to lose this fight tonight the same way you lost it in that courtroom." For one long, terrible moment, nobody moved. The tension in the yard stretched taut enough to snap, and Margaret watched Silas Crane's face twist through fury and disbelief, and something that looked underneath it all, dangerously close to panic. Then, from beyond the tree line, where the road curved down from the main trail, the sound of multiple horses approaching fast broke the silence, and Crane's head snapped toward it with sudden, sharp alarm. "Territorial marshals!" A voice called out across the darkness, and within moments, 4 riders emerged into the yard's lamplight, badges catching the glow rifles already drawn and leveled. "Silas Crane, you're under arrest for fraud, forgery, and arson by order of Judge Harlan Whitfield's court." Crane's 2 hired men didn't hesitate. They wheeled their horses and bolted for the tree line the moment the marshal's rifles came up, abandoning their employer without a backward glance, and Crane himself sat frozen atop his horse. For one final suspended moment, staring at Thomas and Margaret with an expression that had finally completely lost every trace of the cold confidence he'd carried since the day he first walked through Thomas's door. "This isn't over," he said, though the words carried no real menace left in them, now only the hollow defiance of a man who knew deep down that it very much was. "It is for you," the lead marshal said, closing in fast with practiced efficiency, pulling Crane down from his horse and into iron cuffs before he could make any move to flee. "Judge has got a warrant with your name on it long as my arm. Second set of ledgers, forged documents, and a barn fire besides. You're looking at a good long stretch behind bars, Crane, whatever fortune you think you've still got hidden away somewhere." Margaret's legs finally gave out the moment the danger truly passed, and Thomas caught her before she hit the ground, the same steady, sure catch he'd given her that very first stormy night. And this time, she let herself lean into it fully, the shotgun slipping from her trembling hands as relief and exhaustion crashed over her all at once. "It's over," Thomas murmured against her hair, his own voice rough with the same overwhelming relief. "Margaret, it's actually over." The marshals led Crane away within the hour, his fury reduced to sullen, defeated silence, and word would spread through the territory within days that the man who had once controlled half the cattle trade and most of the banking in the region now sat in a territorial jail awaiting trial on charges serious enough to guarantee years behind bars, if not worse. His remaining assets, the marshal explained before riding out, would be seized to satisfy restitution claims from every rancher he'd defrauded, Thomas Bridger's $11,000 chief among them. A week later, a formal summons arrived requesting both Thomas and Margaret's presence at Crane's arraignment, and though neither of them relished the thought of another long ride to the territorial capital, so soon after the last, they went. Understanding that seeing the matter through to its proper legal end mattered as much as anything they'd already survived. The Capitol Courthouse felt different this time. Lighter somehow, the same gallery that had once watched Margaret with skeptical, dismissive eyes, now filled with ranchers and townsfolk, who had traveled considerable distances simply to witness the moment Silas Crane finally answered for what he'd done. Warren Kessler and Abigail Foss sat near the front, and beside them, to Margaret's genuine surprise, sat young Pruitt, no longer trembling, but sitting straight-backed with the quiet dignity of a man who had finally done right by his own conscience. Judge Whitfield read the charges aloud in a flat, formal voice that nonetheless carried the full weight of what Crane had done, fraud spanning 6 years, and touching no fewer than 9 ranching families across the territory, forgery of legal documents, and arson, resulting in significant property destruction. Crane stood before the bench in plain clothes, now stripped of the fine coats and silver-trimmed confidence he'd once worn like armor. And Margaret found she felt no triumph looking at him, only a tired, sober relief that the harm he'd caused had finally fully come to light. "Mr. Crane," Judge Whitfield said, "given the scope and premeditation of your conduct, and given testimony establishing that you personally ordered the arson at Stone Creek Ranch, this court sentences you to 12 years imprisonment, along with full restitution to every victim named in these proceedings to be satisfied through seizure and liquidation of your remaining assets." The judge's sharp eyes swept the gallery briefly before returning to Crane. "I would add for the record that this court finds it particularly troubling that a man of your position used that very position to prey upon those least able to defend themselves. Widows, small ranchers, families already stretched thin by hard seasons. Justice in this territory does not bend for wealth, whatever you may have believed to the contrary." The gavel fell, and Crane was led away in shackles without another word, his face gone gray and hollow, and Margaret watched him go with a strange, complicated mixture of feelings, satisfaction that the truth had finally won out, but also a quiet, unexpected sadness for whatever had made a man choose greed and cruelty so completely over the decency that might have served him just as well. Sheriff Elias Grady's name came up during the proceedings too, Judge Whitfield noting on the record that the Territorial Marshal's office would be reviewing whether the sheriff's evident reluctance to investigate the cut fence and threatening note constituted willful neglect of duty. A review that would, Margaret later learned, cost Grady his badge within the month once evidence emerged that Crane had been quietly paying him for years to look the other way. "Small comfort," Thomas said afterward as they walked out of the courthouse together into bright autumn sunlight. "But comfort all the same. Man like Grady wearing a badge and taking a corrupt banker's coin territory's better off without him." "It is," Margaret agreed. "Though I confess I take more comfort in Pruitt sitting in that gallery with his head held high than I do in any punishment handed down today. That boy risked everything to tell the truth. I hope this territory remembers that about him longer than it remembers his part in Crane's scheme." They rode home lighter than they'd ridden in weeks, the last legal shadow of Silas Crane finally formally behind them, and the closer they drew to Stone Creek, the more Margaret felt something settle deep and certain in her chest, not just relief, but a growing tender hope for whatever came next between herself and the man riding steady beside her. But it was the days that followed, quieter and gentler than anything Margaret had known in longer than she could remember, that mattered more to her than any courtroom victory or arrest. Word of Crane's downfall spread through the territory like wildfire, and with it spread the story of the housekeeper who'd found the fraud and the rancher who'd trusted her enough to fight it alongside her. Ranchers Margaret had never met began arriving at Stone Creek's gate, not with hostility this time, but with gratitude, with offers of lumber and labor, to help rebuild the burned barn, with a respect that Margaret found she still hadn't quite learned how to accept gracefully. After so many years of being taught, she deserved none of it. Warren Kessler arrived personally on the 4th day, a wagon loaded with lumber behind him, and 4 of his own hands ready to work. "Figured a woman who saved my land the same way she saved this one deserves a barn raised quick," he said, tipping his hat to Margaret with a warmth that still occasionally caught her off guard. "Whole territory's talking about you, Miss Doyle, in case nobody's told you that plain yet." Abigail Foss came too, bringing not lumber, but a fresh-baked pie and an embrace so fierce it nearly knocked the breath from Margaret's chest. "You gave me my fight back," the older woman said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'd near given up on ever seeing justice for what that man took from me and Samuel. You didn't let me give up." Ezra sought her out on the 2nd day of the barn raising, still favoring his mending leg, but steady enough now to carry lumber alongside the other hands. And he caught her alone for a moment by the well, his young face uncharacteristically serious. "Miss Doyle," he said, twisting his hat in his hands the way Silverjack often did. "I never got to say it proper, what with the fever, and then you and the boss riding off to the capital so quick after. But I'd have lost this leg maybe worse if you hadn't known what to do that night. I think about that a lot. Man my age losing a leg out here. I don't know what kind of life I'd have had left." His eyes shone bright with an emotion he was clearly fighting to keep steady. "My own mother's 300 miles from here, and I miss her something fierce most days. But I want you to know, ma'am, having you here's made this place feel like home again, in a way it hadn't since I first hired on. I'm grateful, truly." Margaret's throat tightened, and she reached out to squeeze the young man's hand. "You don't owe me thanks for doing what any decent person would do, Ezra. But I'll take it gladly all the same, because it means more to me than you likely know hearing a young man call this place home on my account." She smiled, blinking back her own sudden tears. "Now get that lumber where it belongs before Otis starts hollering at both of us for dawdling." He laughed, startled out of his solemnity, and jogged off toward the barn frame with something lighter in his step than she'd seen since the fever first took him, and Margaret stood by the well a moment longer, letting the warmth of the exchange settle into her before returning to the work at hand. By the end of that first week, the barn raising had become something closer to a celebration than mere labor. A dozen ranchers and their hands working together under a clear autumn sky. Laughter and hammering carrying across the yard. Margaret moving among them with pitchers of cool water and plates of food. No longer the woman who'd knelt bleeding at a gate begging for scraps, but someone the whole territory had begun in the space of a single remarkable month to call by name with genuine respect. Word of everything that had happened traveled faster than Margaret expected, carried along the same channels of gossip and news that had once spread cruel rumors about a heavy-set stranger begging at a mercantile door. A letter arrived at Stone Creek near the end of that second week, addressed in an unfamiliar cramped hand, and Margaret nearly set it aside unread before she recognized the return address as Miller's Creek. She opened it alone in the kitchen, half expecting more cruelty, and found instead a short, awkward apology from the very mercantile owner who had laughed her out his door and let his customers laugh along with him. Purdy wrote that word of her role in exposing Silas Crane's fraud had reached even his small town, that he'd heard the full account from a traveling peddler who spoke of nothing else for a full evening at the saloon, and that he found himself, he admitted, stiffly ashamed of how he'd treated her that day. He enclosed, of all things, a small sum of money. Restitution, he called it, for the bread and the dignity he'd denied her, and asked humbly that she consider the debt between them settled. Margaret sat with the letter for a long while, turning it over in her hands, surprised by how little satisfaction she actually felt reading it. She had imagined once that an apology from Miller's Creek might feel like vindication. Instead, it felt small and distant. A closed door on a chapter of her life that no longer had the power to wound her the way it once had. She showed the letter to Thomas that evening, and he read it twice. His jaw tight, with old anger on her behalf, before something gentler settled over his face. "What will you do with the money?" he asked. "Give it to Ezra's mother, I think," Margaret said, surprising herself with the answer even as she spoke it. "For the son she's missing 300 miles from here. Seems a better use for guilt money than anything I'd spend it on myself." She folded the letter closed. "I don't need Purdy's apology to know my own worth anymore, Thomas. I learned that lesson somewhere on the road between his mercantile door and yours." Thomas's hand found hers across the table, warm and steady. "I'd say you learned it the night you knocked on my door bleeding and asked for scraps, and I told you food belongs on a table. Been trying to prove that same point to you every day since." "You have," Margaret said softly. "More than proved it." The restitution from Crane's seized assets began arriving in the weeks that followed as well, disbursed by the territorial court exactly as Judge Whitfield had ordered. And Thomas found himself for the first time in 4 years looking at a ledger that balanced honestly in his favor rather than working quietly against him. He used a portion of it to finish the barn ahead of schedule, hiring extra hands to speed the work, before winter set in, and set the remainder aside carefully with Margaret's help into accounts that would keep Stone Creek Ranch secure for seasons to come, regardless of weather or market or any future man foolish enough to try what Crane had tried. Warren Kessler and Abigail Foss both received their own restitution in turn, enough to recover the land and dignity Crane had stripped from them. And word reached Stone Creek some weeks later that Abigail had used part of her settlement to hire on 2 additional hands, easing the burden of running her late husband's ranch alone. while Kessler had written a short, gruff letter of thanks that Margaret suspected had taken him considerably longer to compose than its brevity suggested. It was Thomas who pulled her aside that evening, once the last of the ranchers had ridden home, and the new barn frame stood raw and golden against the sunset, its bones already stronger than the one that had burned. "Walk with me," he said, and there was something in his voice, careful and deliberate, that made Margaret's heart begin to beat faster, even before she understood why. They walked out past the mended fence line, past the pasture where the herd grazed calm and content in the fading light, out to a low rise that overlooked the whole spread of Stone Creek Ranch. The new barn, the house with its lamplight already glowing warm in the windows, the fences and the cattle, and the life that Margaret had in the space of one desperate storm-soaked month come to love as fiercely as anything she'd ever known. Thomas stopped there and turned to face her fully, and Margaret watched him gather himself the way she'd seen him do before difficult conversations with the same steady, deliberate courage he'd shown facing down Silas Crane in his own kitchen that first stormy night. "Margaret," he said, "I've been trying to find the right words for near a week now, and I don't believe there are any perfect enough for what I'm trying to say, so I'm just going to say it plain the way you taught me. Plain truth serves better than pretty lies." He took her hands in both of his, rough and steady and sure. "You knocked on my door a month ago, believing you deserved nothing but scraps. I've watched you save this ranch, save Ezra's leg, save half the ranchers in this territory, from a man who thought himself untouchable, and every single day since that storm, I've fallen a little further for the woman who did all of it, without once believing she deserved to be more than an afterthought in her own life." Margaret's eyes filled her breath, catching hard in her throat, but Thomas wasn't finished. "I don't have much left to offer you beyond what you can see standing right here," he continued, voice rough with emotion. He no longer bothered hiding. "A ranch that's been through fire and fraud, both a stubborn man who's better with cattle than with pretty words, and a heart that's been yours, if I'm honest, since the very night you asked me for leftovers, and I realized I'd rather give you everything on my table instead." He drew a steadying breath. "Margaret Doyle, I am asking you with everything I've got to stay. Not as my housekeeper. As my wife, if you'll have me, and as the woman this ranch and everyone on it already loves as much as I do." For a long moment, Margaret couldn't speak at all. The weight of a lifetime spent believing herself unwanted colliding hard against the astonishing, overwhelming reality of a good man kneeling now in the grass before her, offering her not scraps, not charity, but everything he had. "Yes." She finally managed the word, breaking loose on a sob of pure joy she made no effort to hide. "Yes, Thomas, 1,000 times yes." He rose and pulled her into his arms, and this time, there was no danger pressing close enough to steal the moment away, no fear of gunfire or forged documents or cornered desperate men. Only the quiet gold light of an autumn evening settling soft over Stone Creek Ranch. And two people who had found against every hard lesson the world had taught them both exactly the home and the love they'd stopped believing they deserved. Behind them, back at the house, lamplight glowed warm through every window. And somewhere inside, Otis and the others were already setting the table for supper, unaware yet of what had just been decided on the low rise overlooking the ranch. Unaware that the woman who had arrived a month before, asking only for scraps, was about to become, in every way that mattered, the mistress of the very home she'd once believed herself unworthy to even sweep the floors of. Margaret held tight to Thomas's hand as they walked back down toward the house together, her heart fuller than she had ever imagined it could be. And though the fight against Silas Crane had cost them both more than either had expected to give, she understood now, walking beside the man she loved toward the home they would build together, that every hard mile of that fight had led them both step by unlikely step exactly here. Later that night, once the celebration had wound down, and the hands had drifted off toward the bunkhouse, still trading good-natured teasing about the boss finally coming to his senses, Margaret stood a while longer on the porch with Thomas, the autumn air cool and clean around them, the ranch settling into the particular quiet of a place finally at peace. They found the whole household gathered around the supper table when they came through the door, Otis already dishing out stew and grumbling good-naturedly about food going cold, while the boss wandered the property at all hours. And it was Silver Jack, of all people, who noticed first the quiet man's sharp eyes catching the way Thomas and Margaret's hands stayed linked even as they stepped inside, the way neither of them could quite stop the smile tugging at the corners of their mouths. "Well," Silverjack said, setting down his spoon, his weathered voice carrying more warmth than Margaret had heard from him in the whole month she'd known him. "Look what the evening brought in." Otis looked up, followed Silverjack's gaze to their joined hands, and his own spoon clattered straight into his bowl. "Boss, Miss Doyle, is that—" "She said yes," Thomas said, and the pure, unguarded joy in his voice was unlike anything Margaret had heard from him since the night they'd met, even through every triumph of the courtroom and the barn raising both. "Margaret's agreed to be my wife." The bunkhouse-turned-kitchen erupted into noise fit to wake the whole territory, Dutch letting out a whoop that rattled the windows. Carl pounding Thomas so hard on the back, he nearly stumbled into the table. Ezra grinning wide enough to split his face in two, and Otis rising from his chair to pull Margaret into an embrace, so fierce and sudden it lifted her clean off her feet. "Knew it," Otis declared, setting her back down with tears standing plain and unashamed in his eyes. "Knew it the very morning you told me straight to my face you'd earn every penny of your wages, ma'am. Man doesn't fall for a woman like that by accident. Took him long enough to say so out loud, mind you, but I knew it." Silverjack simply rose, crossed the room without a word, and shook Margaret's hand with both of his own, the same gesture he'd offered the night they returned victorious from the courthouse, and this time he allowed himself to speak the sentiment behind it. "This ranch needed you," he said simply. "Glad the boss had the sense to keep you." Margaret laughed through tears. She made no effort to hide, surrounded by a table full of people who had in the span of one remarkable month become something she'd never dared believe she'd have again, a family chosen and fierce and entirely her own, in a home that had once seemed like nothing more than a desperate stop on a road leading nowhere. Thomas caught her eye across the crowded, joyful table, and in his gaze she saw everything. Neither of them needed words for any more gratitude, hope, and a love that had grown quiet and certain out of the very hardest ground either of them had ever known. Outside the new barn frame stood golden and strong against the darkening sky, a testament to everything they'd survived together, and inside, surrounded by the noise and warmth of the family they'd built from nothing but hard work and stubborn faith in each other, Margaret Doyle finally understood all the way down to her bones exactly what it meant to belong somewhere completely. "Otis already started asking about dates," Thomas said, a low laugh in his voice. "Man's more excited about a wedding than he was about beating Crane in court." "There's no rush," Margaret said, leaning into him, content simply to stand there a while longer with his arm around her and the whole wide sky full of stars overhead. "We've got a barn to finish, and a herd to see through winter, and a lifetime ahead of us to get the rest of it right." "A lifetime?" Thomas repeated softly, testing the shape of the word the same careful way she'd once tested his given name. "I like the sound of that a good deal more than I ever expected to." Margaret closed her eyes, breathing in the cold night air and the warm, solid comfort of the man beside her, and let herself simply rest there a while, safe and certain in the home she had once believed she'd never be allowed to claim as her own. Winter settled over Stone Creek Ranch hard and white within a month of that night on the porch, and Margaret found herself busier than she'd ever been in her life, splitting her days between the ordinary demands of a working ranch and the entirely unfamiliar business of planning a wedding. She still some mornings woke up disbelieving was truly hers to plan. "You're doing that thing again," Thomas said one evening in December, watching her from across the kitchen table where she sat with a scrap of paper covered in half-finished notes about flowers that wouldn't grow this time of year, and a guest list that had somehow ballooned to nearly 40 names. "What thing?" "That thing where you look at all this." He gestured at the paper at the warm kitchen at the ring on her finger that had been his mother's. "Like you're waiting for someone to tell you it's a mistake and take it all back." Margaret's hands stilled. He had caught her exactly the same old fear that still crept up occasionally in quiet moments, the disbelief that a life this full and this warm could truly belong to a woman who'd spent so many years believing she deserved nothing more than scraps. "Old habits," she admitted softly. "I'm working on it." Thomas Rose came around the table and knelt beside her chair so their eyes met level. "Nobody's taking this back, Margaret. Not me, not this ranch, not a single soul on it. You earned every bit of this the hard way, and I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure you never doubt it again." She leaned her forehead against his breathing in the familiar comfort of him, and let the old fear loosen its grip a little further, the way it had been loosening steadily since the night he'd first pulled out a chair for her instead of handing her scraps at the door. "It isn't easy," she admitted. "Unlearning a lifetime of believing yourself unwanted. Some mornings I still catch myself bracing for the door to close. Then I'll keep opening it," Thomas said simply. "As many times as it takes for as many years as we've got. That's a vow I intend to keep whether or not the minister ever gets around to making it official." Margaret laughed through sudden tears, the sound bright and unguarded in the warm kitchen, and pressed a kiss to his temple, grateful beyond words for a man who understood that healing old wounds took patience rather than a single grand gesture. The wedding date they had settled on was the first Saturday in April, once the worst of winter had broken, and the roads would be passable for guests traveling from as far as Kessler's Spread and Abigail Foss's ranch. But January tested that plan harder than either of them expected when the worst blizzard in a decade swept down off the mountains without warning and threatened to undo a year's worth of hard-won stability in a single brutal night. Otis pounded on the kitchen door well past midnight snow, already piled thick against his shoulders, shouting that a section of the herd had drifted toward the north pasture during the storm's first hours, and stood now in real danger of freezing solid against the fence line if nobody moved fast to drive them back toward shelter. "How many head?" Thomas was already pulling on his coat, urgency sharp in every movement. "Near 60, boss. Silverjack's out there already trying to hold them, but the wind's fierce enough to steal a man's voice clean out of his mouth, and if we don't get 'em moving toward the low barn quick, we'll lose half of them by morning." Margaret didn't wait to be told to stay behind. She was already wrapping herself in every layer of wool the house possessed, grabbing lanterns and rope, moving with the same fierce determination that had carried her through cut fences and courtroom battles and gunfire in the timber. "You don't have to come out in this," Thomas said, though his voice carried no real expectation that she'd listen. "I know exactly what I have to do, Thomas Bridger, and it's stand beside you when this ranch needs every hand it can get." She pulled her scarf tight against the howling wind already audible even through the shuttered windows. "Now let's go save that herd before we lose another single thing to hard weather or hard luck." The next several hours passed in a blur of screaming wind and driving snow. Margaret working alongside Otis and Silverjack and Dutch and Carl, and even young Pruitt, all of them half-blind in the whiteout conditions, driving frightened half-frozen cattle, step by stubborn step, back toward the safety of the low barn's windbreak. Margaret's hands went numb inside her gloves within the first hour, her lungs burning with every breath of frigid air. But she did not stop. Would not stop, understanding with fierce clarity that every animal saved tonight was one less loss the ranch would have to absorb heading into their first year truly free of Silas Crane's theft. It was well past dawn, the storm finally beginning to break into thin gray light, when they finally got the last of the herd secured, and Margaret collapsed against a fence post, exhausted, past the point of standing upright, snow crusted thick in her hair and along every fold of her clothing. Thomas found her there, pulled her up into his arms, despite his own bone-deep exhaustion, and simply held her a long moment amid the settling snow. "We lost 4 head," he said quietly. "Bad, but nowhere near what it could have been. We saved 56. Margaret said, her voice hoarse from the cold and the shouting. "I'll take that trade every time." "You didn't have to fight that storm alongside the rest of us," Thomas said, brushing snow gently from her hair. "You're going to be my wife in a matter of months, Margaret. A man worries. And I'm going to be the mistress of this ranch," Margaret said, meeting his eyes steady despite her exhaustion. "That means standing in the storm right alongside you, Thomas, same as I stood in the timber in the courtroom and everywhere else this fight has taken us. I don't intend to start hiding from hard weather now of all times." Something fierce and proud flickered behind the worry in Thomas's eyes, and he simply pulled her closer instead of arguing further. Understanding by now, after a full year at her side, exactly how little purpose arguing that particular point would serve, Otis found them there a moment later exhaustion and relief mingling plain across his weathered face as he surveyed the herd now safely huddled against the low barn's windbreak. "Ain't never seen a woman work a storm like that in all my years on this outfit," he said, shaking his head slow. "Boss, you're marrying a rare one, and I don't say that lightly. Believe me, Otis," Thomas said, glancing down at Margaret with an expression that carried the whole weight of everything they'd survived together, "I know exactly what I'm marrying." The wedding date they'd settled on was the first Saturday in April, once the worst of winter had broken, and the roads would be passable for guests traveling from as far as Kessler's Spread and Abigail Foss's ranch. And as the months passed, Margaret watched with quiet wonder as the whole community that had once dismissed her outright began instead to rally around her with a warmth she still hadn't fully learned to expect. Abigail Foss arrived one bitter February afternoon with a bolt of ivory fabric she'd been saving, she said, since before Samuel died, never quite finding the occasion to use it until now. "Some things are meant for exactly the right moment," she said, pressing the fabric into Margaret's hands with tears standing bright in her eyes. "I can't think of a better one than this." They sewed the dress together through the long, cold evenings that followed Abigail's steady hands guiding Margaret's through stitches more delicate than anything she'd attempted before. And somewhere in those quiet hours bent over fabric by lamplight, Margaret found herself telling the older woman things she hadn't spoken aloud to anyone the years of rejection. The slow erosion of believing herself worth anything at all, and how strange and wonderful it still felt most days to be planning a wedding, rather than simply surviving another season of scraping by. "You know what I think," Abigail said one evening, biting off a thread with her teeth in a way that would have scandalized Margaret's mother. "I think the Lord doesn't waste hard years. I think He lets them sharpen a person, same as a whetstone sharpens a blade, so that when the good finally comes, that person's ready to hold on to it properly, instead of letting it slip through soft, untested hands." She smiled warm and knowing. "You held on to Thomas Bridger the way a woman holds on to something she knows the value of, Margaret, because you'd already learned the cost of going without. That's no small thing." Margaret held that thought close through the difficult moments that still came even in the midst of so much happiness, the morning in February, when a letter arrived from the territorial court informing them that Silas Crane's lawyer had filed an appeal seeking to overturn the conviction on a technicality regarding the handwriting expert's qualifications, a development that sent a cold jolt of old fear straight through Margaret's chest, despite everything they'd already survived. "Can he actually win this?" she asked Thomas that evening, the letter trembling slightly in her hands. "Judge Whitfield doesn't strike me as a man who lets technicalities undo 6 years of documented fraud," Thomas said, though the tightness in his own jaw betrayed that he wasn't entirely as calm as his words suggested. "But I won't pretend it doesn't worry me some. Man like Crane, even behind bars, still knows how to make trouble." The waiting stretched 3 anxious weeks in which Margaret found herself unable to fully settle into wedding preparations, the old fear whispering that perhaps none of this was as secure as she'd allowed herself to believe. Relief finally came in the form of a formal notice from the territorial court, delivered by the same young courier, Beckett, who'd once carried their urgent message home from the Capitol during Crane's original hearing. Appeals denied. Thomas read aloud, his voice unsteady with relief as Margaret gripped his arm tight. "Court finds Abbott's testimony sound and the original evidence more than sufficient. Crane's conviction stands full sentence to be served." He looked up at her, something fierce and grateful lighting his face. "It's finished, Margaret. Truly, finally finished." Margaret let out a breath she felt she'd been holding for 3 straight weeks, and something in her chest settled permanently into place. Not just relief, but the last lingering fear finally releasing its hold on her, the understanding sinking in fully at last that this life, this ranch, this man kneeling before her with his mother's ring was hers to keep without condition or asterisk. There was one more piece of unfinished business, that winter one, that mattered to Margaret more than she expected when the opportunity arose. Young Pruitt, Crane's former clerk, had struggled to find work through the fall, his name too closely tied to the scandal for most employers in the territory to risk hiring him, however honorable his testimony had ultimately been. He came to Stone Creek's gate in early March, hat in hand, asking humbly whether the ranch might have need of an extra hand through calving season, and Margaret found Thomas hesitating longer than she expected before he finally nodded slow agreement. "Man told the truth when it cost him everything to do it," Thomas said afterward, watching Pruitt settle into the bunkhouse with the same careful uncertainty Margaret herself had carried that first week. "Seems to me a ranch that got saved by the truth ought to make room for a man willing to tell it whatever came before." Margaret found Pruitt alone by the corral a few days later, watching the cattle with the careful attention of a man trying hard to prove himself worthy of a second chance, and she came to stand beside him without judgment, remembering all too well what it felt like to arrive somewhere new, carrying the weight of other people's assumptions. "Thank you," Pruitt said quietly, not quite meeting her eyes, "for convincing him to take me on. I know what I was part of, even if I tried to make it right at the end. I don't expect forgiveness I ain't earned. You earned it the moment you stood up in that courtroom knowing exactly what it might cost you," Margaret said. "This ranch believes in second chances, Mr. Pruitt. I'm living proof of that myself." She smiled, warmth breaking through the cold March air. "Work hard, keep telling the truth, and you'll find Stone Creek's a good place to build the rest of your life same as I did." By the time April finally arrived, soft and green after the long, hard winter, Stone Creek Ranch had transformed into something Margaret still found herself pausing to marvel at: wildflowers blooming thick along the mended fence lines. The new barn standing strong, and finished cattle grazing fat and healthy across pastures that had one desperate autumn nearly been lost entirely. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, and Margaret stood in the small room that had once been simply her own, now dressed in the ivory gown she and Abigail had sewn together through the long winter evenings, her hands trembling with a nervousness that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with the overwhelming joyful weight of the day ahead. Ezra's mother, a small warm woman named Ruth, who'd traveled the full 300 miles, despite her own advancing years, found Margaret in the final quiet moments before the ceremony began, and took both her hands with a fierce, grateful grip. "My boy wrote me every week this past year," Ruth said, her voice thick with emotion. "Told me about the fever, about you sitting up all night packing his wound, about how you never once made him feel like a burden for needing tending. I came all this way just to thank you proper face to face for giving my son back to me whole." She squeezed Margaret's hands tighter. "I don't know what I'd have done losing him so far from home. You gave me my boy's life, Mrs. Bridger, even before you were rightly Mrs. Bridger at all." Margaret's composure nearly broke entirely at that, and she pulled Ruth into an embrace that surprised them both with its warmth. "He's a fine young man," she said once she trusted her voice again. "You raised him well, ma'am. I only did what any decent person would have done." "Decent people are rarer than you'd think," Ruth said simply. "Especially the kind willing to sit up all night proving it." Abigail fussed over the final details of her hair, and through the window, Margaret could see the yard filling steadily with guests, ranchers and hands and townsfolk who had, over the course of one remarkable year, come to know her not as a stranger to be assessed and dismissed, but as a woman the whole territory had learned to respect. "You look radiant," Abigail said, stepping back to survey her work with visible pride. "Samuel would have loved seeing this dress find its purpose." "I only hope I do it justice," Margaret said, smoothing the fabric with hands that still trembled slightly. "Child, you've already done more justice in this territory than most folks manage in a lifetime." Abigail took her hands firmly. "Now stop fretting and go marry that good man before he wears a hole clean through the yard pacing." The ceremony itself passed in a blur of warmth and emotion that Margaret would spend years afterward trying and failing to fully capture in memory. Otis, walking her down the makeshift aisle between rows of gathered guests, his own eyes suspiciously bright. The entire way, Silver Jack standing witness with a solemnity that suited the occasion perfectly, Dutch and Carl having somehow convinced themselves to wear proper collars for the first time anyone could remember. Thomas stood waiting at the end of that aisle, looking. Margaret thought exactly like a man who had spent a year rebuilding not just a ranch, but an entire life he'd once believed was finished. And when their eyes met across that short distance, every lingering shred of doubt about whether she deserved any of this simply dissolved away entirely. "Do you, Thomas Bridger?" the traveling minister asked, his voice carrying clear across the assembled crowd. "Take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health for richer or poorer, for as long as you both shall live." "I do," Thomas said, and the certainty in those two words carried the full weight of everything they'd survived together. The storm, the ledgers, the courtroom, the fire, the gunfire in the timber, all of it distilled down into a promise as solid and unshakable as the mountains rising behind them. "And do you, Margaret Doyle, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health for richer or poorer for as long as you both shall live?" Margaret looked at Thomas, at the life they'd built from nothing but a stormy night and a shared refusal to let injustice stand unchallenged, and felt the words rise up from someplace deeper than memorized vows, someplace true. "I do," she said, "with my whole heart and gladly." The minister pronounced them husband and wife, and when Thomas kissed her, the whole yard erupted into cheering loud enough to startle every bird for a mile around Dutch and Carl, whooping fit to wake the dead. Otis openly weeping now without a shred of embarrassment, and Silver Jack silent as ever, simply nodding once with a smile that said everything his usual reticence never could. As the meal wound down and the fiddler took his first break of the evening, Otis rose from his seat with a cup raised high and an expression that suggested he'd been rehearsing this moment for weeks, despite his usual gruff reluctance toward speeches. "Now I ain't a man of many words," he began, prompting a round of good-natured laughter from Dutch and Carl, who'd clearly heard him practicing at length in the bunkhouse. "But I've known Thomas Bridger going on 6 years now, and I never once in all that time seen him look at anything the way he looks at this woman standing beside him." He turned to Margaret, his weathered face suddenly serious. "Miss Doyle, Mrs. Bridger. Now I suppose you walked up that road a year back, asking for nothing but scraps, and instead, you gave this whole outfit something we didn't even know we were missing. You gave the boss someone worth building toward, instead of just surviving for. You gave Ezra his life back, and Kessler and Foss their land back, and this whole territory a reason to believe justice still means something, even when the man doing wrong's got money enough to buy most folks' silence." His voice caught, and he cleared his throat hard before continuing. "To Thomas and Margaret, may this table always have room enough for anyone who needs it, same as it did the night she first knocked on that door." The whole gathering raised their cups in answer, a chorus of voices carrying warm across the evening air, and Margaret felt her eyes fill with tears. She made no attempt to blink away, overwhelmed by the sheer generous weight of being so thoroughly publicly loved by people who had once been strangers and were now in every way that mattered family. Silver Jack offered his own toast after Otis sat down, brief as everything he said, but no less heartfelt for its brevity. "Home ain't the wood in the land," he said, raising his own cup. "It's who's sitting at the table with you. This ranch has both now finally proper. To the Bridgers and to every soul this table will ever welcome after them." The celebration that followed stretched long into the golden afternoon and well past sunset, tables groaning under food, that half the territory had contributed fiddle music, striking up as the light began to fade, and Margaret found herself at one point standing at the edge of the dancing with Otis, who'd claimed the second dance with the gruff insistence of a man who considered it his rightful due. "Never thought I'd see the day," Otis said, spinning her with more grace than his weathered frame suggested he possessed. "Woman shows up starving at our gate, and inside a year, she saved this ranch, married the boss, and turned half this territory into her own extended family. If that ain't a story worth telling grandchildren someday, I don't know what is. I couldn't have done any of it without every one of you," Margaret said, meaning it fully. "This ranch became my home because all of you let it, Otis. That's not something I'll ever take lightly." Partway through the evening, Margaret noticed a small commotion near the refreshment table. A pair of townsmen from the capital, drawn out by curiosity, over the scandal, muttering low and pointed remarks in Pruitt's direction, as the young man stood alone near the edge of the gathering. His shoulders hunched, with old shame. He clearly hadn't fully shed, despite months of honest work. Didn't figure Crane's own clerk would have the nerve to show his face at a celebration, one of the men said, not quite quiet enough. Margaret was moving before she'd fully decided to, but Thomas reached the two men first, his voice carrying easy and firm across the small gathering. That man stood up in a courtroom and told the truth against the most powerful banker in this territory. Thomas said, knowing full well it might cost him everything he had left. I don't much care for guests at my wedding who can't extend the same grace this whole territory's been extending to me and my wife since the day we walked into that courthouse. You're welcome to enjoy the food and the music, gentlemen, or you're welcome to find your horses. Your choice entirely. The two men had the decency to flush and mumble apologies before drifting toward the far side of the gathering, and Margaret crossed to where Pruitt still stood, offering him a plate piled generous with food. Sit with us, she said simply. You've more than earned your place at this table, same as everyone else here tonight. Pruitt's eyes shone bright with an emotion he clearly struggled to name, but he accepted the plate and accepted too the seat. Margaret gestured toward beside Ezra and Silver Jack, and for the rest of that golden evening, nobody at Stone Creek Ranch treated him as anything less than exactly what he'd become, one of their own, welcomed fully and without condition. Later that evening, once the dancing had wound down and most of the guests had begun the long journeys back to their own spreads, Margaret found a quiet moment alone with Thomas near the new barn, its timber still golden and fresh against the darkening sky. 1 year ago tonight, she said softly, leaning into him. Give or take a few weeks, I was kneeling in the mud outside a door I had no right to knock on, begging for whatever scraps a stranger might spare. And instead, Thomas said, wrapping his arms around her, you got a full plate, a home, a family, and a fool of a rancher who fell for you before he even fully understood why. Margaret laughed, tears standing bright and happy in her eyes. I got considerably more than scraps, Thomas Bridger. You got everything on the table, he said, echoing the very words he'd spoken to her that first stormy night, and Margaret felt the full circle of it settle warm and complete in her chest. Same as I promised you that very first evening. Food belongs on a table, not thrown to the dogs. Turns out the same was true of you, Margaret. You always belonged at this table. Just took the world a good long while to catch up to that truth. The months that followed unfolded with a steadiness Margaret had never dared hope to know. Spring calving season, bringing new life to the pastures, summer stretching long and golden across land that had one desperate year before nearly slipped away entirely. Warren Kessler rode over in June with news of his own, grinning wide and uncharacteristically bashful as he announced his intention to marry the schoolteacher from his own township, a courtship he credited with rough gratitude to finally having the courage to believe good things could still come to a man who'd once nearly lost everything. Abigail Foss, for her part, had taken on a role nobody quite expected, riding a circuit between the ranches Crane had once preyed upon, helping other widows and struggling ranchers learn to read their own ledgers, the way Margaret had once taught her. Determined that no one in the territory would ever again fall victim to a scheme like Crane's simply for lack of knowing how to ask the right questions of a column of numbers. You started something bigger than just saving one ranch, Abigail told Margaret during a visit that August, watching Margaret move through the kitchen with the particular unhurried grace of a woman well settled into the rhythms of her own home. Half this territory understands now that a body doesn't have to accept whatever a powerful man tells them is fair. That's your legacy, whether you ever meant to build one or not. Margaret considered that a long moment, drying her hands on her apron as she settled into the chair across from her old friend. I never set out to build a legacy, Abigail. I only set out to survive a storm and then to fix what wrong I found once someone finally gave me a table to sit at and eyes willing to trust what I saw in those ledgers. She smiled warm and a little rueful. But I suppose that's how most worthwhile things get built, isn't it? Not by grand design, but by one honest person refusing to look away from what needed doing, and then finding they weren't alone in that refusal after all. Well, however it happened, Abigail said, reaching across to squeeze her hand. This territory is kinder for it and safer, and I don't believe either of us will live to see all the good that keeps rippling outward from one storm-soaked night at your gate. By autumn, Margaret found herself sitting on the same porch where Thomas had once proposed, one hand resting instinctively over a gentle new curve at her middle watching the sunset paint the ranch in warm amber light. "You're thinking hard about something," Thomas said, settling beside her, his hand covering hers where it rested. "Just thinking how strange it is," Margaret said, "that the worst night of my life led me straight to the best one. If those men in Miller's Creek hadn't thrown those stones, if I hadn't been quite so desperate and quite so far from anywhere else to turn, I might never have found this road at all." "Then I suppose I owe those fools a strange sort of thanks," Thomas said, "though I'd still take great pleasure in horsewhipping every one of them given half a reason." Margaret laughed, resting her head against his shoulder, watching the barn stand strong against the fading light, the herd settling calm in the near pasture. Otis and Ezra's voices, carrying faint and easy from the direction of the bunkhouse, where Pruitt had by now become simply another trusted hand, rather than a man carrying old shame. Abigail Foss visited often these days, and Warren Kessler had taken to sending word ahead whenever he planned a trip through the whole loose network of ranchers Crane had once preyed upon, now bound together by something stronger than mere geography, a shared understanding of what it meant to be seen and believed and fought for when the world had decided otherwise. A brief notice arrived from the Territorial Marshal's office that same autumn, almost an afterthought amid the fullness of their lives, confirming that Silas Crane remained exactly where justice had placed him, his name now spoken of in the territory mostly as a cautionary tale told to warn young clerks and ambitious bankers alike against mistaking cruelty for cleverness. Margaret read the notice, once felt nothing more than the quiet satisfaction of a closed door, and set it aside without a second thought. Her attention already returned to the far more pressing business of choosing names for the child growing steadily beneath her heart. "I used to believe," Margaret said quietly, "that a woman built the way I'm built, with the history I carried, simply wasn't meant for a life like this. Wasn't meant for love, or a full table, or a home that felt like it belonged to me as much as I belonged to it. I spent so many years making myself small, asking for scraps because I'd convinced myself scraps were all I deserved." Thomas turned to look at her fully, his weathered face soft with a tenderness that still even now caught her breath. "And what do you believe now?" Margaret looked out over the ranch that had become, against every hard lesson the world had once taught her, entirely and completely her home. The barn rebuilt stronger than the one that burned, the fences mended, and holding the family gathered close around a table that had never once since that first storm-soaked night offered her anything less than everything it had. "Now I believe," she said, her voice steady and sure and entirely her own, "that every soul deserves a full plate and a place at the table. Not because they've earned it through suffering, but simply because they exist, and because kindness costs the giver nothing but the courage to offer it freely. I believe the world is fuller of decent hearts than the cruel ones ever let on, and that sometimes it only takes one open door to prove that true." She turned to face Thomas, fully love and certainty shining plain in her eyes. "And I believe with everything I am that the home someone builds with love and courage will always outlast the ruin that greed and cruelty try to build in its place." Thomas pulled her close, and together they watched the last light fade gentle over Stone Creek Ranch, over the barn standing tall against the darkening sky, over a life neither of them had dared imagine, on the night a starving, desperate woman knelt bleeding at a stranger's gate, and asked in a whisper, barely louder than the falling rain, whether she might be allowed the leftovers from his table. Their daughter was born the following spring on a clear morning, with the whole ranch holding its breath outside the bedroom door. Abigail Foss serving as midwife, with the same steady competence she brought to everything. And when Thomas finally held his newborn child for the first time, tears cutting clean tracks through the dust on his weathered face, Margaret watched him, and understood with a certainty that settled deep into her very bones that the circle begun on that storm-soaked night had finally closed complete. They named her Hope over Otis's gruff but clearly delighted protestations that a rancher's daughter ought to have a sturdier name, and the whole territory seemed to take the christening as occasion enough for another gathering nearly as large as the wedding itself. Kessler and his new wife Abigail beaming with pride, Pruitt holding the infant with a careful tenderness that spoke of a man who had built slowly and honestly, an entirely new life for himself, on the foundation of one difficult truth once told. Margaret wrote one final letter to Miller's Creek that spring. Not to Purdy this time, but to the town itself. Care of its small newspaper offering an account of everything that had happened since the day she'd been driven from its streets with stones. Not out of bitterness. She was careful to write, but so that any other woman treated the way she once had might read it and understand that a single town's cruelty was never the final word on anyone's worth. The editor printed it in full, and Margaret heard months later, secondhand, through a traveling peddler, much like the one who'd once carried news of her courtroom victory, that more than one family in Miller's Creek had read her words aloud at their own supper tables and thought a little harder afterward about how they treated strangers who arrived at their doors with nothing but hunger and hope. She had asked for scraps that night. She had been given instead a full plate, a fierce and loving family, a home rebuilt stronger than the fire that once tried to take it, and a man who had looked at a woman the world called unworthy and seen from the very first moment someone worth every chair at his table. That was the truth Margaret Doyle carried with her every single day that followed, through every season and every hardship yet to come. Unshakable and complete. That dignity was never something the world could grant or withhold. At its convenience, that a person's worth was never measured by the size of their body, or the depth of their poverty, or the cruelty of strangers who mistook meanness for judgment, and that sometimes, against every hard lesson, a broken world tries to teach. Love finds exactly the person it was always meant to find, and refuses from that moment forward to ever let them go hungry again. No storm, no scandal, no cruelty ever again had the power to convince her otherwise, and not one soul at Stone Creek Ranch ever let her forget it. And on Stone Creek Ranch, beneath a Montana sky turning gold and endless toward evening, that was precisely, completely, and forever true.